The night started off innocently enough, with pizza, video games, and the usual banter that my best friend Ethan and I shared during our sleepovers. We had been best friends since elementary school, and our sleepovers were a cherished tradition. This time it was at Ethan's place, a cozy, two-story house on the outskirts of town. It was a typical summer night, warm and filled with the sounds of crickets and distant laughter from neighbors' houses. We stayed up late, watching horror movies and challenging each other in the latest video games. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. Ethan's parents were out of town for the weekend, so it was just the two of us. We set up our sleeping bags in his room, talking about everything and nothing until we finally drifted off to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night, a chill running down my spine. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The room was dark, the only light coming from the pale moonlight filtering through the curtains. I turned over in my sleeping bag, trying to get comfortable again when I noticed that Ethan's bed was empty. "Ethan?" I whispered, sitting up and rubbing my eyes. There was no response. A sense of unease settled over me as I looked around the room. Then I saw him, standing by the window, his back to me. He was perfectly still, staring out into the night. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the summer air. "Ethan, are you okay?" I asked, louder this time. He didn't respond or move. His silhouette was eerily motionless, and something about his posture made my skin crawl. I got up and walked over to him, my footsteps quiet on the carpet. As I got closer, I noticed his eyes were open, but they seemed vacant, as if he wasn't really seeing anything. "Hey man, are you sleepwalking?" I asked, gently touching his shoulder. He turned slowly to face me, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "It's calling me," he whispered, his voice a hollow monotone that sent shivers down my spine. What's calling you?" I asked, my heart pounding. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to the window, staring out into the darkness. I followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual, just the empty street and the trees swaying in the breeze. The moonlight cast long, eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Ethan, snap out of it," I said, shaking him lightly. "You're freaking me out." He blinked slowly, as if coming out of a trance. I don't know," he said, his voice trembling. "I was dreaming, I think, but it felt so real." "Let's just go back to bed," I suggested, trying to sound reassuring. "It's probably just the movies we watched messing with your head." He nodded, and we both went back to our sleeping bags. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the night. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off. I was jolted awake again sometime later, the room feeling unnaturally cold. I turned over and saw Ethan standing by the window again, staring out with that same vacant expression. This time, he was whispering something under his breath. "Ethan, come on, this isn't funny," I said, getting up once more. My heart raced as I approached him. "You need to wake up." He turned to me, his eyes wide and fearful. "It won't stop," he whispered. "It's calling me. It wants me to come." I felt a surge of panic. "What are you talking about? Who's calling you?" Before he could answer, he started walking towards the door, his movements stiff and mechanical. I grabbed his arm, trying to stop him. "Ethan, you're sleepwalking. You need to wake up." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a terror that made my blood run cold. "I can't stop it," he said. "I have to go." He pulled away from me with surprising strength and headed downstairs. I followed him, my mind racing. He walked through the dark house, straight to the front door, and opened it. The night air was cool and filled with the sounds of the forest that bordered his backyard. "Ethan, where are you going?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. He didn't answer. He stepped outside and began walking towards the woods. I ran after him, my heart pounding in my chest. The trees loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, their branches swaying in the wind. "Ethan, stop!" I shouted, but he kept walking, his gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. I grabbed his arm again, trying to pull him back. "You're not yourself. You need to wake up." He turned to me, and for a moment his eyes seemed to clear. "Help me," he whispered. "Don't let it take me." "Take you? What are you talking about?" I asked, but before he could answer, his expression went blank again. He pulled free from my grip and continued into the woods. I followed him, the darkness closing in around us. The further we went, the colder it became, and the sounds of the night grew distant and muffled. It felt like we were entering another world, one that existed just beyond the veil of reality. "Ethan, please stop," I begged, but he kept walking, his movements slow and deliberate. We reached a clearing, and Ethan stopped in the center, staring up at the sky. The moonlight illuminated his face, and I saw tears streaming down his cheeks. "It's here," he said, his voice a broken whisper. "I can't fight it." I looked around, trying to see what he was talking about, but there was nothing there. Just the trees and the shadows and the cold, oppressive silence. Then I heard it, a soft, low hum that seemed to come from all around us. "Ethan, we need to go back," I said, grabbing his hand. "This isn't right. We need to leave." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "It's too late," he said. "It's already here." The hum grew louder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The shadows seemed to shift and move, taking on shapes that defied logic. I pulled on Ethan's hand, trying to drag him back towards the house, but he wouldn't budge. "Ethan, please," I pleaded, my voice breaking. "Come back with me." He shook his head, tears falling freely now. "I can't," he said. "I'm sorry." Before I could react, he let go of my hand and stepped into the center of the clearing. The hum grew louder, and the shadows closed in around him, enveloping him in darkness. I reached out, but it was like an invisible barrier kept me from getting any closer. "Ethan," I screamed, but he was already gone, swallowed by the night. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The hum faded, and the clearing was silent once more. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the spot where Ethan had vanished. Eventually, I turned and ran back to the house, my heart heavy with grief and fear. I called the police, but they found no trace of Ethan. He was gone, disappeared without a trace. The official story was that he had run away, but I knew the truth. Something had taken him that night, something from beyond our understanding. I never told anyone what really happened. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw, and I know that Ethan is out there somewhere, trapped in the darkness. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the hum again. A haunting reminder of the friend I lost and the terror that still lingers in the shadows. It was a typical Friday night when my friends and I decided to have a sleepover at Mark's house. We had all grown up together, our bond forged in the shared experiences of childhood. Mark's basement had always been our hangout spot, a place where we could escape from the watchful eyes of parents and be ourselves. That night, as we gathered our sleeping bags and snacks, there was an air of excitement. It had been a while since we had all been together like this, and the basement had a certain nostalgic charm. The old couches, the flickering TV, the worn-out rug, all of it felt like home. We settled in, the dim light of the basement creating a cozy atmosphere. Mark's parents were out of town for the weekend, so we had the house to ourselves. We played video games, watched horror movies, and laughed until our sides hurt. It was perfect, or so we thought. Around midnight, the power went out. The sudden darkness was jarring, plunging the basement into an oppressive blackness. The only light came from the glow of our phones, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Great," Mark muttered, fumbling for a flashlight. "Probably the storm." We hadn't even noticed the storm brewing outside, the wind howling and rain pounding against the windows. Mark found the flashlight and clicked it on, the beam slicing through the darkness. "Let's make it more interesting," Jack said with a grin. "How about some ghost stories?" We all agreed, huddling together on the old couches, the flashlight casting long, dancing shadows. Jack started with a story about a haunted forest, his voice low and dramatic. Sarah followed with a tale about a ghostly hitchhiker. When it was my turn, I hesitated. I had always been sensitive to the supernatural, and something about the basement felt off that night. But I didn't want to seem like a coward, so I began my story about the old asylum on the outskirts of town. As I spoke, I noticed a change in the atmosphere. The basement seemed colder, the shadows darker. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to me like a second skin. Just as I was finishing my story, we heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the far corner of the basement. We fell silent, listening intently. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. "What is that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Probably just the pipes," Mark said, though he didn't sound convinced. The tapping continued, echoing through the basement. It seemed to be coming from behind the old wooden door that led to the storage room. We rarely went in there. It was filled with boxes of old junk and had always given us the creeps. "Let's check it out," Jack said, his bravado masking his nervousness. We followed him to the door, the flashlight beam flickering slightly. Mark reached for the handle, but the door was locked. "That's weird," he said. "It's never been locked before." Just then, the tapping stopped, replaced by a soft, whispering sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent chills down my spine. We all looked at each other, fear evident in our eyes. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Yeah," Jack replied. "Let's get out of here." We turned to leave, but the door to the basement slammed shut with a deafening bang. We were plunged into darkness, the flashlight flickering and finally going out. "Someone get the light!" Mark shouted, panic creeping into his voice. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight app. The beam was weak, but it was better than nothing. We huddled together, the whispering growing louder, more distinct. "Help me," it said, the voice low and mournful. "Please, help me." "Who's there?" Sarah called out, her voice shaking. There was no response, only the continued whispering. We moved towards the basement door, trying to get out, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it shut. "We need to get out of here," Jack said, his voice filled with urgency. We tried the windows, but they were stuck fast. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. "Help me," it repeated, a sense of desperation in the voice. "Let's try the storage room," Mark suggested. "There's a window in there." We turned back to the old wooden door. The tapping had started again, more frantic this time. I held the phone's flashlight steady as Mark fumbled with the lock. To our surprise, the door creaked open. The storage room was filled with old boxes and furniture, covered in a thick layer of dust. The air was musty, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. We searched for the window, but it was boarded up. "What now?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with panic. Before anyone could answer, the whispering turned into a low, guttural moan. The air grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned, and there she was, a figure, shrouded in darkness, her eyes glowing with an eerie light. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice sending a chill down my spine. We backed away, the figure moving closer. The moaning grew louder, more agonized. I felt a cold hand brush against my arm, and I screamed. "Get out!" Mark shouted, pulling us towards the door. We stumbled out of the storage room, the door slamming shut behind us. The whispering continued, now coming from all around us. We ran to the basement stairs, pounding on the door, shouting for help. The door finally burst open, and we scrambled up the stairs, not stopping until we were outside, gasping for breath. The storm had passed, the air cool and fresh. We huddled together, our hearts racing, the memory of the basement's horrors etched into our minds. We never spoke of that night again. Mark's parents moved shortly after, selling the house to a new family. We went our separate ways, but the experience left a scar on each of us. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispering again. It's faint, almost drowned out by the sounds of the night, but it's there. "Help me," it says, a haunting reminder of the terror we faced in that basement. And I know, deep down, that whatever was in that basement is still there, waiting for someone to help. But I also know that I will never go back. Some things are better left forgotten, buried in the darkness where they belong. I still remember that night vividly, the night that changed everything. It was supposed to be a fun sleepover at my best friend Ethan's house. We had planned it for weeks, gathering snacks, movies, and games to fill the night with laughter and memories. But the night took a turn none of us could have anticipated, one that haunts me to this day. Ethan's house was old, one of those grand Victorian homes that looked both majestic and eerie, depending on the lighting. That night, under the silver glow of the full moon, it looked particularly foreboding. But we were excited, and our minds were far from ghost stories or haunted houses as we set up our sleeping bags in the spacious living room. Ethan's parents had gone out for the evening, leaving us with the house to ourselves. We spent the first few hours playing video games, stuffing our faces with pizza, and watching cheesy horror movies. As midnight approached, the excitement of the day began to wear off. and we settled into our sleeping bags, the room dimly lit by the flickering light of the TV. We were drifting off to sleep when we heard it, a soft, rhythmic thumping coming from above. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but Ethan's wide eyes told me he had heard it too. We exchanged uneasy glances, the thumping continuing, steady and persistent. "Is there something in the attic?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Ethan shrugged, looking genuinely puzzled. "I don't know, my parents never go up there. It's mostly just old furniture and junk." The thumping grew louder, more insistent, as if something or someone was trying to get our attention. We sat up, our hearts pounding in our chests. The house, which had felt warm and welcoming earlier, now seemed cold and menacing. "We should check it out," Ethan said, his voice trembling slightly, "just to make sure it's nothing." Reluctantly, I agreed. We grabbed our flashlights and crept up the stairs, the old wood creaking under our weight. The thumping grew louder as we reached the second floor, the door to the attic looming at the end of the hallway like a dark, gaping maw. With a shaky hand, Ethan reached for the doorknob. The door opened with a long, drawn-out creak, revealing a narrow staircase leading up into the darkness. The thumping was almost deafening now, echoing down the stairs and reverberating through the house. We climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling like a leap into the unknown. When we reached the top, we found ourselves in a large, dusty attic, filled with old furniture covered in white sheets. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, and our flashlights barely pierced the darkness. The thumping had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. We moved cautiously through the attic, our flashlights illuminating the ghostly shapes of forgotten furniture and boxes. I could feel my pulse in my throat, the fear almost tangible. Then we heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. We froze, our flashlights swinging towards the source of the noise. In the far corner of the attic, partially obscured by shadows, was an old wardrobe. The shuffling continued, coming from inside the wardrobe. We exchanged terrified glances, but neither of us dared to move. The door of the wardrobe creaked open slowly, revealing a dark, empty interior. The shuffling stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a child, a young girl, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide and empty. She was dressed in an old-fashioned nightgown, her hair tangled and matted. She stared at us with a look of indescribable sorrow, her eyes reflecting a depth of despair that chilled me to the bone. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, help me." We were rooted to the spot, unable to speak or move. The girl took a step closer, her eyes pleading. "They locked me in here," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been here for so long." Ethan found his voice first. "Who locked you in here?" he asked, his voice shaking. "My parents," she replied. "They thought I was different. They didn't want anyone to know. Please, you have to help me." Something about her story didn't add up, but the fear and desperation in her eyes were real. We couldn't just leave her there. Ethan moved closer to her, his hand outstretched. Before he could reach her, the attic door slammed shut with a force that shook the house. We spun around, our flashlights casting frantic beams of light across the room. The temperature dropped suddenly, our breath visible in the cold air. The girl's expression changed, her sorrowful eyes turning cold and menacing. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice now a chilling hiss. "You can't leave." Panic surged through me, and I grabbed Ethan's arm. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. We ran to the attic door, but it was locked tight. The girl's laughter echoed around us, a haunting, mocking sound that filled the attic. "You can't leave," she repeated, her voice echoing in my mind. Desperation set in, and we pounded on the door, shouting for help. But our cries were met with only silence and that eerie laughter. I turned to face the girl, but she was gone, vanished into the shadows. "Ethan, we need to find another way out," I said, trying to keep the panic from overwhelming me. We searched the attic frantically, looking for any possible escape. But the windows were boarded up, and the only door was the one that had slammed shut. The shadows seemed to move around us, the air growing colder and heavier. Then we heard the thumping again, this time coming from beneath us, as if something was trying to break through the floor. The boards began to creak and groan, and we backed away, our flashlights flickering. Without warning, the floor gave way, and we fell through, landing hard in a small, dark room below the attic. The air was damp and musty, and the only light came from our flickering flashlights. We were in a cellar, a hidden room beneath the house. The thumping continued, now louder and more frantic. I shone my flashlight around the room, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw them. Skeletons, dozens of them, huddled together in the corners, their bony fingers clawing at the walls. Ethan let out a strangled cry, and we backed away, our eyes wide with terror. The thumping grew louder, coming from all around us. The skeletons seemed to move, their hollow eyes turning towards us, their jaws opening in silent screams. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." We scrambled to our feet, searching for an exit. In the far corner of the cellar, we found a narrow staircase leading up. We ran up the stairs, our flashlights barely illuminating the way, the thumping growing louder with each step. When we reached the top, we found ourselves back in the basement, the door to the outside standing open. We didn't hesitate. We ran out of the house, the cold night air hitting us like a slap to the face. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of the streetlights. We never spoke of that night again. Ethan's parents returned the next day, unaware of what had happened. The house stood silent and dark, its secrets hidden within its walls, but the memory of that night haunts me still. The girl, the skeletons, the thumping. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the thumping again, echoing in my mind. And I know that the house is still there, waiting, its dark secrets ready to claim another soul. And I know that I will never be able to forget, never be able to escape the terror of that night. It all started as a thrilling adventure, something to mark the end of our high school years and the beginning of whatever lay ahead. It was supposed to be one last hurrah before we all scattered to different colleges and jobs. Jack, Sarah, Kevin, and I had grown up together, our friendships solidified over countless sleepovers, late-night talks, and shared secrets. The idea of spending a night in the old abandoned house on the edge of town seemed like the perfect way to seal our bond. The house had been vacant for as long as any of us could remember. It was a grand old Victorian, once beautiful, but now decayed and overgrown with ivy. The stories about it were legendary, whispers of ghostly apparitions, strange noises, and the family who had vanished without a trace decades ago. Of course, we didn't believe in any of that. We were teenagers, armed with flashlights, sleeping bags, and enough snacks to last us the night. We met at the edge of the woods just after sunset, the sky ablaze with the dying light of day. Jack was the ringleader, as always, his grin wide and infectious. "Ready for a night we'll never forget?" he asked, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Definitely," Kevin replied, his voice steady but his eyes betraying a hint of nervousness. Sarah and I exchanged a glance, both of us feeling the same mixture of fear and anticipation. The path to the house was overgrown, branches grabbing at our clothes as we made our way through the dense underbrush. As we approached the clearing where the house stood, the atmosphere grew heavier, the air thick with an unnameable tension. The house loomed before us, its windows dark and empty, its once white paint peeling away in long, curling strips. "Here we are," Jack said, pushing open the rusted gate that led to the front yard. Home sweet home. We followed him up the creaking steps to the front door, which hung slightly ajar. The hinges groaned in protest as Jack pushed it open, and we stepped inside. The air was cool and musty, filled with the scent of dust and decay. Our footsteps echoed off the high ceilings and empty rooms as we made our way to the parlor, where we decided to set up camp. The parlor was the least damaged room in the house, with a large fireplace dominating one wall and a few pieces of broken furniture scattered about. We laid out our sleeping bags in a circle, placing our flashlights and snacks in the center. "This is going to be awesome," Jack said, settling into his sleeping bag. "Just think of the stories we'll have to tell." We spent the first few hours talking and laughing, our voices filling the empty space and pushing back the darkness. As the night wore on, the conversation turned to ghost stories, each tale more gruesome and terrifying than the last. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the windows. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply and an eerie silence settled over the house. We huddled closer together, the flickering beams of our flashlights casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. We fell silent, listening. At first there was nothing, just the wind and the creaking of the old house. Then faintly we heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on a table. "It's probably just the wind," Kevin said, though his voice lacked conviction. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. It seemed to be coming from upstairs. Jack grabbed his flashlight and stood up. "Let's go check it out," he said, his bravado wavering. We followed him up the grand staircase, the steps groaning under our weight. The tapping grew louder, echoing through the empty halls. As we reached the top of the stairs, we saw that the hallway was dark, the air even colder than before. The sound led us to a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. Jack pushed it open and we stepped inside. The room was empty, save for an old, dusty rocking chair in the corner. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. "I guess it was nothing," Jack said, his voice uncertain. We turned to leave, but as we reached the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed the handle, pulling with all my might, but it wouldn't budge. "Let us out!" Sarah screamed, pounding on the door. Then we heard it, a low, guttural whisper, like the voice of someone who hadn't spoken in years. "You shouldn't be here." We turned to see a figure standing in the shadows, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman, her face gaunt and hollow, her eyes dark and empty. She took a step closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "Leave this place," she whispered, her voice rising in a chilling crescendo. We backed away, our fear mounting. The woman's eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold dread wash over me. She raised a hand, pointing to the door, and I felt an unseen force pushing me toward it. Suddenly, the door flew open, and we stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. We didn't stop to question what had happened. We ran down the stairs and out of the house, not stopping until we were back in the safety of the woods. We never spoke of that night again. The house stood silent and dark, its secrets hidden within its decaying walls. But the memory of the woman haunted me, her hollow eyes and chilling voice echoing in my mind. Months passed, and we all went our separate ways. But the experience left a mark on me, a lingering sense of unease. One night as I lay in bed, I heard a faint tapping on my window. My heart raced as I got up to look, but there was nothing there. Just the wind, I told myself. Then the tapping came again, louder this time. I froze, fear gripping me. Slowly I turned and saw her, standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes locked onto mine. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, her voice filling the room. I screamed, but no sound came out. The room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in around me. I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, and the last thing I saw was her face, twisted into a grotesque smile. The next morning, they found me in my bed, my eyes wide with terror, my heart stopped. The doctors couldn't explain it, but I knew the truth. The house had claimed me, just as it had claimed the Thorne family all those years ago. And now it waits for its next visitors, ready to share its dark secrets with those who dare to enter. It was the kind of dare that seemed harmless at first, the kind of challenge only teenagers would come up with. "Let's have a sleepover in the old Thorne house," Jack had said, grinning mischievously. "It'll be fun. Besides, everyone says it's haunted." We were four: Jack, Sarah, Kevin, and me. The idea of spending the night in the abandoned house on the edge of town was thrilling, a perfect way to end the summer before we all went back to the monotony of school. The Thorne house had been empty for decades, left to rot after the last of the Thorne family mysteriously disappeared one night. It was a staple of local lore, a place where no one dared to tread after dark. Armed with sleeping bags, snacks, and a couple of flashlights, we made our way to the Thorne house as the sun dipped below the horizon. The house loomed before us, its once grand facade now a crumbling relic. The windows were shattered, and the door hung loosely on its hinges, swaying slightly in the evening breeze. "Are we really doing this?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with nervous excitement. "Of course," Jack replied confidently. "It's just an old house. There's nothing to be afraid of." We stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under our weight. The air was thick with dust, and the faint scent of mold hung in the air. We set up our sleeping bags in the living room, where the remnants of old furniture were scattered about, covered in grime and cobwebs. As the night grew darker, we entertained ourselves with ghost stories, each tale more gruesome than the last. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of excitement and fear, the shadows in the corners of the room seeming to grow darker and more oppressive with each passing hour. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply, and an eerie silence settled over the house. We huddled closer together, the glow from our flashlights casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. "Did you hear that?" Kevin whispered, his eyes wide. We fell silent, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the sound of our own breathing. Then, faintly, we heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on the wall. "It's probably just the wind," Jack said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. It seemed to be coming from upstairs. Against my better judgment, I stood up, flashlight in hand. "Where are you going?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I'm going to check it out," I replied, though every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay put. Jack and Kevin stood as well, and together we made our way to the staircase. The steps groaned under our weight, and with each step, the tapping grew louder. As we reached the top of the stairs, we saw that the hallway was dark and cold, the air almost palpable with an unseen presence. The tapping led us to a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, and the sound was louder now, almost deafening. With a trembling hand, I pushed the door open, and we stepped inside. The room was empty, save for an old, tattered armchair in the corner. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. We stood there, unsure of what to do next, when suddenly the door slammed shut behind us. Panic set in, and we rushed to the door, pulling and pounding, but it wouldn't budge. The room grew colder, and the air was filled with the faint scent of decay. Then we heard it, a low, guttural whisper, like the voice of someone who hadn't spoken in years. "Get out." We turned to see a figure standing in the shadows, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman, her face gaunt and hollow, her eyes dark and empty. She took a step closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "Get out," she repeated, her voice rising in a chilling crescendo. We backed away, our fear mounting. The woman's eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold, creeping dread wash over me. She raised a hand, pointing to the door, and I felt an unseen force pushing me towards it. The door flew open, and we stumbled out into the hallway, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. We didn't stop to question what had happened. We ran down the stairs and out of the house, not stopping until we were back in the safety of the streetlights. We never spoke of that night again. The Thorn House stood silent and dark, its secrets hidden within its decaying walls. But the memory of the woman haunted me, her hollow eyes and chilling voice echoing in my mind. Years later, I learned the truth. The last of the Thorn family, a woman named Eliza, had gone mad after losing her children to a tragic accident. She had been locked away in the house, forgotten by the world, until she had taken her own life. Her spirit lingered, trapped in the place of her torment, and we had unwittingly disturbed her rest. The realization filled me with a cold dread, knowing that her anger had been directed at us and that we had narrowly escaped her wrath. But sometimes late at night, I still hear the tapping, and I know that she is still there, waiting for the next foolish souls to dare enter her domain. And I know that next time, they might not be so lucky. Driving late at night always had a certain allure. The world bathed in moonlight, the roads nearly deserted, and the sense of being the only person awake in a slumbering world. But on this particular night, the thrill had long worn off. Exhaustion clung to me like a second skin, my eyes heavy, my thoughts slow. I had been driving for hours, the dark highway stretching endlessly before me. I had hoped to reach the next town before stopping, but fatigue was winning the battle. The glowing numbers on the dashboard clock told me it was well past midnight, and I knew I needed to find a place to rest. The problem was, there seemed to be no rest stops, no hotels, Nothing but the dark, winding road and the dense forest pressing in on either side. Just as I was starting to despair, I saw a sign, weathered and barely legible, pointing to a small dirt road that veered off into the forest. Rest area 2 miles, it promised. Relief washed over me, and I turned onto the narrow path, the car's headlights cutting through the darkness. The road was rough, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. Branches scraped against the car, and the further I drove, the more isolated I felt. After what felt like an eternity, the road opened up into a small clearing. In the center stood an old, decrepit cabin, its wooden walls sagging with age. It was not the rest area I had imagined, but it was a place to stop. I parked the car and sat for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. The cabin looked abandoned, but it was shelter. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting through my thin jacket. Gravel crunched underfoot as I approached the cabin, the beam of my flashlight revealing boarded-up windows and a door hanging on rusty hinges. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside. The air was musty, filled with the scent of decay and neglect. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I explored the single room. There was a rickety table and chair, an old wood-burning stove, and a cot in the corner covered in a layer of dust. It wasn't much, but it would do for a few hours of sleep. I set my flashlight on the table, the beam casting long shadows on the walls. After a quick inspection to ensure there were no unwelcome critters, I lay down on the cot, using my jacket as a pillow. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves outside and the distant hoot of an owl. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was an irrational fear, I told myself, a product of exhaustion and the eerie surroundings. But the feeling persisted, a prickling at the back of my neck that kept me from fully relaxing. I awoke with a start, my heart pounding. The cabin was pitch black, my flashlight having gone out. I fumbled for my phone, using its weak glow to illuminate the room. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, an almost tangible presence in the darkness. Then I heard it, a faint shuffling sound coming from outside. I sat up, straining to listen. The noise grew louder, footsteps crunching on the gravel. I held my breath, fear creeping into my veins. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and I could hear someone breathing, slow and steady. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, only the sound of breathing. I grabbed my flashlight, shaking it until the beam flickered back to life. Slowly I stood and approached the door, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my feet carrying me forward. I reached for the door handle, and as I did, the breathing stopped. I pushed the door open, shining the flashlight into the night. The clearing was empty, the car sitting undisturbed where I had left it. There was no sign of anyone. I stepped outside, the cold air a sharp contrast to the stuffy cabin. "Is anyone there?" I called again, my voice louder this time, but the only response was the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Maybe it was just an animal, I reasoned, or the wind playing tricks on me. I turned to go back inside when I saw them, footprints in the gravel, leading from the edge of the clearing to the door of the cabin. A chill ran down my spine as I followed the footprints with my flashlight. They were fresh, clearly defined in the loose gravel. Someone had been here, standing right outside the door while I slept. Panic surged through me, and I hurried back into the cabin, slamming the door shut and wedging the chair under the handle for good measure. I sat on the cot, clutching the flashlight, my mind racing. Who had been outside? Why hadn't they responded? I checked my phone, but there was no signal. I was completely alone, isolated in this desolate place. Hours passed, the oppressive silence weighing on me. I tried to stay awake, but exhaustion eventually claimed me, pulling me into a fitful sleep. I dreamed of shadows moving through the trees, of cold hands reaching for me, of whispered voices calling my name. I woke again, my heart racing. The cabin was silent, but the feeling of being watched was back, stronger than ever. I sat up, gripping the flashlight, and listened. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from beneath the floorboards. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, moving closer to where I sat. I swung the flashlight beam across the floor, but saw nothing. Gathering my courage, I stood and began to search for the source of the noise. The scratching led me to a corner of the cabin, where the floorboards were loose and rotting. I pried one up, the wood splintering in my hands, and shone the flashlight into the dark space below. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, in the crawlspace beneath the cabin, was a pile of bones, human bones, tangled together in a macabre embrace. Skulls grinned up at me, their empty eye sockets seeming to follow my every move. A wave of nausea hit me, and I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grasp. The scratching continued, louder now, and I realized with growing horror that it was coming from all around me. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder and heavier. I grabbed the flashlight and bolted for the door, the chair clattering to the floor as I yanked it open. I ran to the car, my heart pounding, the night air freezing against my skin. I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to unlock the door and scramble inside. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. In the rearview mirror, I saw the cabin receding into the distance, its dark silhouette fading into the trees. As I drove, the scratching sounds faded, replaced by the hum of the engine and the thrum of my own heartbeat. But the sense of dread lingered, a heavy weight in my chest. I knew I had narrowly escaped something terrible, something that defied explanation. I drove until the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the safety of civilization slowly returning. I pulled into a gas station, my hands shaking as I filled the tank and grabbed a cup of coffee. The clerk gave me a curious look, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be as far from that cabin as possible. I never spoke of what happened that night. Who would believe me? But the memories haunt me still, the footsteps, the breathing, the bones beneath the floorboards. And sometimes in the dead of night, I wake with a start, the sound of scratching echoing in my ears, a reminder that some places are better left undisturbed. The cabin had always been there, nestled deep in the heart of the forest, a place whispered about in hushed tones among the townsfolk. Few dared to venture near it, and those who did often returned with tales of eerie sounds and unsettling feelings. It was an old structure, weathered by time and nature, its wooden walls covered in moss and ivy, giving it an almost camouflaged appearance amidst the towering trees. Growing up, I had heard the stories, how children would go missing every few years, last seen playing near the edge of the forest. It was always the same. A search party would be organized, the entire town would scour the woods, but no trace of the children was ever found. Eventually, the search would be called off, and the parents would be left with nothing but heartache and unanswered questions. Despite the warnings, I had never believed in the old legends. I was a skeptic, grounded in reality and logic. But that changed the summer my younger brother Sam disappeared. It was supposed to be a carefree afternoon, just a group of kids playing hide-and-seek near the woods. I was supposed to be watching them, keeping an eye out to make sure they didn't wander too far. But when it was time to go home, Sam was nowhere to be found. Panic set in, and I led the frantic search, calling his name until my voice was hoarse. But as the hours turned into days, hope dwindled. Driven by guilt and desperation, I decided to search the forest myself. Armed with a flashlight and a few supplies, I ventured into the dense woods, following the faint trails and broken branches that hinted at Sam's path. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. I walked for hours, the forest growing darker and more foreboding with each step. The once familiar sounds of birds and rustling leaves were replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw it, the cabin. It stood there, hidden among the trees, its presence almost ethereal in the dim light. A shiver ran down my spine as I approached, the air growing colder and heavier. The cabin's door was slightly ajar, as if inviting me inside. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest, but the thought of Sam gave me the courage to push the door open. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of decay. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing a single room filled with old, rotting furniture and dust-covered shelves. The walls were adorned with strange symbols, carved deep into the wood, their meanings unknown. I called out for Sam, my voice echoing off the walls, but there was no response. As I moved further into the cabin, I felt a sense of dread growing within me, an almost tangible fear that something was terribly wrong. In the far corner of the room, I saw a trapdoor, partially hidden beneath a threadbare rug. With trembling hands, I pulled the rug aside and lifted the trapdoor. A cold, damp air wafted up from the darkness below, carrying with it a faint, sickly sweet odor. I shone my flashlight down into the abyss, revealing a narrow staircase leading into the depths of the earth. Taking a deep breath, I descended the stairs, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The further down I went, the colder and darker it became until I reached the bottom. The flashlight's beam revealed a small subterranean chamber, its walls covered in the same strange symbols as the cabin above. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw what lay upon it. There, bound and unconscious, was Sam. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. I rushed to his side, frantically checking for injuries. As I worked to free him from his restraints, I felt a presence behind me. Turning slowly, I saw a figure standing in the shadows, watching us with cold, unblinking eyes. It was an old woman, her face gaunt and twisted with malice. Her clothes were tattered, and her skin was as pale as the moonlight filtering through the cracks in the ceiling. "You shouldn't be here," she rasped, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What have you done to my brother?" The old woman stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with a sinister light. "I am the guardian of this place," she said. "And your brother, he is mine now." Rage and fear surged through me, and I stood protectively over Sam. "He's not yours," I spat. "We're leaving." The woman laughed, a hollow, chilling sound that echoed through the chamber. "You cannot leave," she said. "Not until the ritual is complete." I didn't wait to hear more. I grabbed Sam, lifting him over my shoulder, and began to ascend the stairs. The old woman's laughter followed us, growing louder and more deranged. As we reached the top of the stairs, the trapdoor slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. Desperation fueled my strength as I pounded on the door, my fists bruising against the wood. "Let us out!" I screamed, but there was no response. Suddenly, the cabin filled with a blinding light, and I felt an intense heat radiating from behind me. I turned to see the symbols on the walls glowing with an otherworldly fire, the flames licking at the wood but leaving no scorch marks. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of burning, and the old woman's voice filled the room, chanting in a language I couldn't understand. With a surge of adrenaline, I kicked at the trapdoor with all my might. It flew open, and I dragged Sam up the stairs and out of the cabin. The forest outside was alive with unnatural energy, the trees swaying violently as if caught in a storm. I ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, the old woman's chants echoing in my ears. As we broke through the tree line, the chanting stopped abruptly, and the forest fell silent. I collapsed to the ground, cradling Sam in my arms, tears streaming down my face. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "You're safe now," I whispered, relief flooding through me. "We're safe." But as I looked around, I realized we were not out of the woods yet. The symbols were etched into the trees, glowing faintly in the darkness. The air was still thick with the scent of decay, and I knew we had to keep moving. We stumbled back to town, exhaustion and fear driving us forward. When we finally reached home, we were met with disbelief and relief. Sam was taken to the hospital, where he made a full recovery, but the experience left us both scarred. The cabin was never found. Despite multiple searches, it seemed to have vanished, leaving no trace behind. The town moved on, but the missing children were never forgotten, and neither was the old woman's laughter, which haunted my dreams. Years passed, but the memories remained vivid, a constant reminder of the darkness lurking in the forest. One night as I lay in bed, I heard a faint whisper in the wind, carrying the old woman's voice. "You cannot escape," she whispered. "The forest always takes its due." I knew then that the cabin was not gone, merely waiting, and that one day it would call again, drawing another lost soul into its grasp, and this time there would be no escape. I woke up to darkness. My head throbbed with a dull, persistent pain, and my mouth felt dry and parched. As I blinked, trying to adjust my eyes to the dim light, the first thing I noticed was the rough texture of the concrete floor beneath me. I tried to sit up, but my body protested, stiff and sore from lying in an awkward position for what felt like hours. Gradually, my surroundings came into focus. I was in a small, windowless room, the walls bare and cold. A single, dim light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting weak, flickering shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. Panic surged through me as I realized I had no idea where I was or how I had gotten there. I forced myself to stand, every muscle in my body protesting. The room was empty except for a small metal cot pushed against one wall and a rickety wooden chair in the corner. The air was musty and stale, carrying a faint metallic scent that made my stomach turn. The door, a heavy, rusted metal slab, stood ominously at the far end of the room. I stumbled towards it, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed the handle and twisted, but it was locked tight. Desperation clawed at me as I pounded on the door, shouting for help. "Hello? Is anyone there? Let me out!" My voice echoed in the confined space, but there was no response. I pounded on the door again, harder this time, but it remained stubbornly closed. I slumped against it, my mind racing with fear and confusion. How had I ended up here? The last thing I remembered was falling asleep in my own bed, the familiar comfort of my room enveloping me. Now I was trapped in this cold, empty cell, with no memory of how I had gotten here. I forced myself to take a deep breath and think. There had to be a way out. I walked around the room, searching for any clue or hidden exit. The walls were solid concrete, and the only light came from the flickering bulb above. I checked the cot and the chair, but there was nothing unusual about them. Then my eyes fell on a small, rectangular vent near the floor. It was just large enough to fit an arm through. I crouched down and peered inside, but all I could see was darkness. I reached in, my fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. A shiver ran down my spine as I pulled my hand back, revealing a small, rusted key. My heart leapt with hope. I scrambled to the door and tried the key in the lock. It fit, but the mechanism was old and rusty, and I had to jiggle it several times before it finally turned with a loud click. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the door handle, then pushed it open. The door creaked loudly as it swung open, revealing a long, narrow hallway dimly lit by a series of flickering lights. The walls were the same cold, bare concrete, and the air was thick with the same musty scent. I stepped out into the hallway, the door swinging shut behind me with a resounding clang. I moved cautiously down the corridor, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, with no sign of an exit. I passed several doors, all of them closed and locked. The sense of unease grew stronger with each step, the oppressive silence pressing down on me. Then I heard it, a faint, distant sound, like someone crying. I froze, straining to listen. The sound was coming from further down the hallway. I hurried towards it, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. Maybe I wasn't alone after all. As I rounded a corner, I saw another door slightly ajar, the crying growing louder. I approached cautiously, pushing the door open with a trembling hand. Inside was another small room, similar to the one I had woken up in. And there, huddled in the corner, was a young woman, her face buried in her hands as she sobbed. "Hey," I said softly, stepping into the room. "Are you okay?" She looked up, her eyes wide with fear. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "My name is Alex," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I woke up in a room like this. I don't know how I got here. Do you?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, I just woke up here. I don't remember anything." I crossed the room and knelt beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're going to get out of here," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "We'll find a way." She nodded, her sobs subsiding into quiet sniffles. I helped her to her feet, and we stepped back into the hallway together. The oppressive silence seemed even heavier now, but at least I wasn't alone. We continued down the hallway, checking each door we passed. Most were locked, but one opened into another small, empty room. There was no sign of an exit, no windows, nothing but the cold, bare walls and flickering lights. As we reached the end of the hallway, we found another door, this one slightly ajar. I pushed it open cautiously, revealing a large, dimly lit room. The air was even colder here, and the metallic scent was stronger. In the center of the room stood a large metal table, and scattered around it were various surgical instruments, all covered in a fine layer of dust. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what this room was. It looked like some kind of operating room, long abandoned. The woman beside me gasped, her hand tightening on my arm. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, her voice filled with terror. I nodded, my own fear mounting. We turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. I rushed to it, pulling and pounding, but it wouldn't budge. We were trapped. Then the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The woman's grip on my arm tightened, and I could hear her rapid, panicked breathing. "Stay close," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'll find another way out." I fumbled for my flashlight, clicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the room's grim details. The metal table, the surgical instruments, and the walls covered in strange, dark stains. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and a soft, whispering sound filled the room. It was like a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, their words unintelligible but filled with malice. I swept the flashlight around the room, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The woman beside me whimpered, her fear palpable. I took her hand, trying to offer some comfort, but my own terror was rising. "We need to find another exit," I said, my voice shaking. "There has to be another way out." We moved cautiously through the room, the whispers growing louder with each step. At the far end, we found another door, this one slightly ajar. I pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. "Come on," I said, pulling the woman along with me. "This has to lead somewhere." We descended the stairs, the air growing colder and the whispers louder with each step. At the bottom, we found ourselves in another hallway, this one even narrower and more oppressive than the first. The walls seemed to close in around us, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows. We hurried down the hallway, checking each door we passed. Most were locked, but one opened into a small, dimly lit room. Inside, we found a window, covered by heavy bars. "Look," I said, pointing to the window. "We're underground. If we can find a way to break those bars, we can get out." The woman nodded, hope flickering in her eyes. We searched the room for something to use, and finally found a heavy metal pipe. Together, we worked to pry the bars loose, our fear driving us forward. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as we worked. I could feel a cold, oppressive presence closing in around us, but I forced myself to focus on the task at hand. Finally, the bars gave way, and we pushed the window open, the fresh air a welcome relief. I helped the woman through first, then climbed out after her. We found ourselves in a narrow alley, the night sky above us. "We made it," the woman said, her voice filled with relief. "We're out." But as I looked around, I realized we were still in the same nightmare. The alley was dark and oppressive, the buildings looming over us like silent sentinels. The whispers were still there, echoing in my mind. "We need to keep moving," I said, taking her hand. "We need to get as far away from here as possible." We ran through the alley, the darkness closing in around us. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the cold presence following us. Suddenly, the woman screamed and fell, her hand slipping from mine. I turned to help her, but she was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I called out her name, but there was no response. Panic surged through me, and I ran, the whispers echoing in my ears. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. The alley twisted and turned, the buildings closing in around me. Finally, I stumbled out into the open, the cool night air a welcome relief. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, but nothing looked familiar. I was still trapped in the nightmare, unable to escape. The whispers grew louder, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned, but there was no one there. The darkness closed in, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I would never wake up. It was a chilly autumn evening, and I was home alone, relishing the quiet solitude that came so rarely. I had settled into my favorite armchair in the living room, wrapped in a warm blanket, the glow of the television casting flickering shadows on the walls. The house was silent except for the low murmur of the TV. I had chosen a classic horror movie to match the season, something to get my adrenaline pumping while I sipped on a hot cup of tea. The clock on the mantel showed it was just past 11 p.m. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows, but inside I felt snug and safe. The movie had just reached its first chilling climax when I heard a sound that didn't belong, the creak of a door hinge. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I muted the TV and listened intently. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind. Then, there it was again, the unmistakable sound of a door slowly opening. It was coming from the basement. My heart began to race. I lived alone, and I knew I had locked the basement door earlier. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or the house settling, but deep down, I knew better. Gathering my courage, I grabbed the flashlight from the side table and stood up, the blanket falling to the floor. The hallway leading to the basement door was dark, the only light coming from the flickering TV behind me. I moved slowly, my steps cautious and silent. When I reached the basement door, it was ajar, the darkness beyond it seeming to pulse with a life of its own. I took a deep breath and pushed the door fully open, shining the flashlight down the stairs. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar sight of the basement, an unfinished space filled with old furniture, boxes, and a washer and dryer. Nothing seemed out of place, but the door had definitely been opened by something or someone. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, debating whether to go down or to call the police. But I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I decided to investigate. I started down the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The air grew colder as I descended, the damp, musty smell of the basement wrapping around me. When I reached the bottom, I swept the flashlight beam across the room, my pulse pounding in my ears. Everything looked normal, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I moved slowly, checking behind the old furniture and boxes, but found nothing. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard a faint whisper, so soft I could barely make it out. It seemed to come from the far corner of the basement, where an old wooden door led to a small storage room. The door was slightly ajar, and the whispering seemed to be coming from within. My hands shook as I approached the door. I reached out and pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. The storage room was pitch black, the flashlight beam revealing nothing but old shelves lined with dusty jars and cans. The whispering stopped as soon as I opened the door, replaced by an oppressive silence. I was about to close the door and head back upstairs when I noticed something on the floor. Footprints, faint but unmistakable, leading from the storage room to the basement stairs. They were wet, as if someone had walked through water. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run back up the stairs. But as I did, the basement door at the top slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging me into darkness. I sprinted up the stairs, my flashlight flickering wildly, and tried the door. It was locked. Desperation took over as I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but I knew no one would hear me. I was alone, trapped in the basement with whatever had opened the door. I turned back towards the basement, the flashlight beam shaking in my trembling hand. The oppressive feeling of being watched had returned, stronger than ever. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck and spun around, shining the light wildly. The beam caught a figure standing at the bottom of the stairs. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes dark and hollow. She wore a tattered dress, and her long, wet hair clung to her face. She stared up at me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised a hand and pointed towards the storage room. I felt an overwhelming compulsion to follow her gaze, to see what she was pointing at. I moved towards the storage room, my legs feeling like lead. When I reached the room, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small, dusty mirror hanging on the wall. The glass was cracked and dirty, but I could see my reflection clearly. And behind me, the woman stood, her eyes locked onto mine through the mirror. I spun around, but the room was empty. The woman was gone. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and whipped around again, but there was nothing there. The whispering started again, louder this time, filling the room with an eerie, unintelligible murmur. I backed out of the storage room, my heart pounding, and ran towards the stairs. The door at the top was still locked, and I pounded on it in desperation. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, replaced by a chilling silence. I turned to find the woman standing at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes fixed on me. She began to ascend the stairs, each step slow and deliberate. In a blind panic, I backed away from the door, my flashlight flickering and finally going out. The darkness was complete, and I could hear her footsteps getting closer. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use its light, but it slipped from my trembling hands and clattered down the stairs. Her footsteps stopped, and I felt her presence right in front of me. I could barely breathe, the terror overwhelming. Her cold hand touched my face, and I felt a searing pain shoot through my head. I screamed, but no sound came out, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in the living room, the morning sun streaming through the windows. My head throbbed, and I felt a deep, bone-chilling cold. The TV was off, and the house was eerily silent. I stumbled to my feet and glanced at the clock. It was 7 a.m. Had it all been a dream? I felt a faint hope, but when I looked down, I saw the wet footprints leading from the basement door to where I had been lying. The basement door was wide open, and from the darkness below, I heard the faint sound of whispering. I grabbed my keys and fled the house, not daring to look back. I knew I could never return. The woman in the basement would always be there, waiting, and I knew deep down that she would never let me go. I had always enjoyed the quiet comfort of my home, especially on evenings when I had the place to myself. It was a modest two-story house nestled in a peaceful neighborhood, far enough from the city to escape its constant hum. That night was no different. I had settled into the living room with a good book, the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm light over the pages. It was late, the kind of late where the world outside falls silent, and even the sounds of passing cars are a distant memory. I relished these moments of solitude, where I could unwind and let the stress of the week melt away. The only sounds were the faint ticking of the clock and the occasional creak of the house settling. I was deep into the story when I noticed it, a flicker of light from upstairs. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the eye from staring at the pages for too long. But then it happened again, more pronounced this time. The light in the hallway at the top of the stairs was flickering, casting erratic shadows on the wall. A shiver ran down my spine. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just a faulty bulb. Still, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread gnawing at the edges of my mind. With a reluctant sigh, I set my book down and stood up, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. As I approached the staircase, the flickering grew more intense, the light almost strobing now. I hesitated at the bottom step, peering into the darkness beyond the intermittent flashes of light. "It's just a light bulb," I muttered to myself, hoping to quell the rising fear. Just a light bulb. I took a deep breath and started up the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The flickering light cast disorienting shadows, warping the familiar surroundings into something sinister. When I reached the top, I could see the hallway clearly. The light fixture was swinging slightly, as if disturbed by a breeze, though all the windows were closed. The air was colder up here, and I hugged my arms to my body, shivering. The hallway stretched out before me, the doors to the bedrooms and bathroom closed, their frames outlined in the pulsing light. I walked slowly, each step a battle against the urge to turn and run back downstairs. As I reached the light fixture, I reached up to steady it, but as soon as my fingers touched the cold metal, the flickering stopped, plunging the hallway into darkness. My heart pounded in my chest, and I fumbled for the switch, flipping it off and then on again. The light returned, steady and unwavering, as if nothing had happened. I let out a shaky breath and turned to go back downstairs. That's when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound like a whisper. I froze, straining to listen. The whispering continued just at the edge of hearing, coming from the end of the hallway. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence. I took a cautious step forward, then another, my eyes fixed on the door at the end of the hallway. It was the guest bedroom, a room I rarely used. As I reached for the doorknob, the whispering started again, louder this time, more urgent. I felt a cold draft emanating from the room, chilling me to the bone. Summoning all my courage, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind me. I could make out the shape of the bed, the dresser, the old rocking chair in the corner. The whispering was louder now, filling the room, but there was no one there. I stepped inside, my heart racing. The air was freezing, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in front of me. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, but I still couldn't understand the words. It was as if multiple voices were speaking at once, overlapping and intertwining. I moved towards the rocking chair, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion. As I got closer, the whispering reached a fever pitch, and the chair began to rock slowly, creaking with each movement. I reached out a trembling hand, and as soon as my fingers brushed the wood, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. I stood there, frozen, staring at the chair, and then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The room was pitch black now, the hallway light extinguished. I fumbled for the light switch, but my fingers found only cold, smooth wall. Panic set in, and I turned back to the chair, my eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. I could barely make out its shape, but I could feel a presence, something cold and malevolent, watching me. The whispering started again, right next to my ear. I spun around, but there was no one there. I backed up, stumbling over the edge of the rug, and fell to the floor. The whispering was all around me now, voices overlapping, growing louder and louder until it was a cacophony of sound. I clapped my hands over my ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was inside my head, relentless and unyielding. I crawled towards the door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. The room grew colder, and I could feel something closing in on me, pressing against me from all sides. I screamed, the sound swallowed by the whispering, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The room was silent, the air still and heavy. I lay on the floor, gasping for breath, my body trembling. After what felt like an eternity, I gathered the strength to stand. I reached for the door again, and this time it opened easily. I stumbled into the hallway, my heart still racing, and ran down the stairs, not stopping until I was back in the living room. The lamp by the couch was still on, casting a warm, comforting light. I collapsed onto the couch, pulling the blanket around me, and tried to calm my racing heart. I glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. I knew I couldn't stay in the house. Whatever had happened upstairs, whatever presence had been in that room, I couldn't face it again. I grabbed my keys and my phone and fled the house, not bothering to lock the door behind me. I drove to a friend's house, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was safely inside their warm, well-lit home. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words caught in my throat, and I could only shake my head, tears streaming down my face. That night, I slept fitfully, plagued by nightmares of whispering voices and dark, cold rooms. When I woke in the morning, I knew I couldn't go back to the house. I called a moving company and arranged to have my things packed and put into storage. I never returned to that house. Whatever had haunted it, whatever had whispered to me in the darkness, I left it behind. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my new apartment, I hear the faintest whispering just at the edge of hearing. And I wonder if I ever truly escaped. It was a rainy Friday evening, and I was finally home alone after a grueling week at work. The steady patter of rain against the windows created a soothing backdrop as I settled into my favorite armchair with a mug of hot tea. My small house was my sanctuary, a cozy haven where I could escape the chaos of the world. The neighborhood was quiet, as it always was. Most of my neighbors were elderly or families who kept to themselves. I appreciated the tranquility, especially on nights like this, when all I wanted was to relax and unwind. I had just turned on the TV, scrolling through channels to find something mindless to watch, when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I glanced around the living room, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, but it was just me and the flickering screen. Shaking off the feeling, I turned back to the TV. The sensation persisted, though, a prickling at the back of my neck that refused to be ignored. My eyes drifted to the window, where the curtains were drawn but not fully closed. Through the small gap, I could see the dark silhouette of my neighbor's house across the street. And there he was, standing at his window, staring directly into mine. My breath caught in my throat. Mr. Thompson, an elderly man who lived alone, was watching me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. His face was partially obscured by the rain-streaked glass, but his eyes were unmistakable, fixed on me with an eerie stillness. I forced a smile, lifting my hand in a half-hearted wave, hoping to break the tension. He didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there, watching. Unease settled over me like a heavy blanket. I tried to focus on the TV, but my gaze kept drifting back to the window, to Mr. Thompson's unwavering stare. Minutes passed, feeling like hours, and still, he didn't move. I decided to close the curtains completely, blocking out his unnerving gaze. As I stood up, a flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed by a clap of thunder that rattled the windows. I pulled the curtains shut, plunging the room into a comforting cocoon of darkness. But the feeling of being watched didn't dissipate. It grew stronger, more insistent, as if Mr. Thompson's eyes could pierce through the fabric. I sat back down, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. An hour later, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to confront him, to understand why he was watching me. Grabbing my raincoat, I headed out into the storm, the cold rain soaking through my clothes almost immediately. I crossed the street, my footsteps splashing through puddles, and made my way to Mr. Thompson's front door. I knocked loudly, the sound swallowed by the rain. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time, and called out, "Mr. Thompson? Are you okay?" Still no response. I peered through the front window, but the house was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of a lamp in the living room. I couldn't see him anywhere. I tried the doorbell, but it didn't work. Frustration and fear gnawed at me as I pounded on the door one last time. Finally, it creaked open, and I stepped inside, calling out his name again. The house was eerily silent, the air thick with a musty odor. I made my way through the dimly lit hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The living room was empty, the window where he had been standing now dark and lifeless. I moved deeper into the house, checking each room, but there was no sign of him. As I reached the back of the house, I found a door slightly ajar, leading down to the basement. A faint light seeped through the crack. "Mr. Thompson," I called out, my voice trembling. "Are you down there?" No response. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to leave, but something compelled me to descend the stairs. The basement was dimly lit, cluttered with old furniture and boxes. The air was damp and cold, the faint sound of dripping water echoing through the space. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw him. Mr. Thompson was standing in the middle of the room, facing away from me, his back rigid and straight. Relief and fear washed over me in equal measure. "Mr. Thompson, what are you doing?" I asked, stepping closer. He didn't respond. I reached out to touch his shoulder, and as soon as my fingers made contact, he collapsed to the floor. Panic surged through me as I knelt beside him, checking for a pulse. His skin was cold, lifeless. I stumbled back, horror gripping me. That's when I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound from the far corner of the basement. I turned, my flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the room. The light caught movement, and I saw a figure lurking in the shadows. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure stepped into the light, and I gasped. It was a woman, her face gaunt and pale, her eyes hollow and empty. She moved closer, her movements jerky and unnatural. "Leave," she whispered, her voice a raspy hiss. "You don't belong here." I backed away, my heart racing. "Who are you? What do you want?" "Leave," she repeated, her eyes locked onto mine, "or you'll end up like him." Fear overwhelmed me, and I turned and ran up the stairs, the woman's chilling whisper following me. I burst out of the house and into the rain, not stopping until I was back in my own home. I locked the door behind me, my mind racing. Mr. Thompson was dead, and there was a strange woman in his house. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my hands shaking as I explained what had happened. They arrived quickly, but when they searched the house, they found no sign of the woman. Mr. Thompson's body was there, just as I had found it, but the basement was empty. They ruled his death as natural causes, but I knew the truth. I had seen her heard her warning. The police didn't believe me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, watching. Every night, I kept my curtains tightly closed, the memory of Mr. Thompson's stare haunting me. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood returned to its quiet normalcy, but the sense of unease never left me. I felt her presence, lurking in the shadows, waiting. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a soft tapping on my window. My heart skipped a beat as I approached, peeking through the gap in the curtains. She was there, standing in the rain, her hollow eyes locked onto mine. Her lips moved, forming a single word: leave. I knew then that there was no escaping her. She had taken Mr. Thompson, and now she was coming for me. The light flickered, and the room grew cold. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The tapping continued, relentless and inescapable. The house that had once been my sanctuary had become a prison, and there was no way out. The last thing I saw was her face, pressed against the glass, her eyes empty and soulless. And I knew, in that moment, that I was doomed to share Mr. Thompson's fate. The darkness closed in, and the world faded away, leaving me alone with her forever. I had always enjoyed the solitude of my small house, tucked away at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It was my sanctuary, a place where I could unwind and escape the constant noise of the world. But that night, solitude turned into isolation, and the house that once felt comforting now felt like a trap. It was a Friday night, and I had planned for a relaxing evening. I had made a simple dinner, watched a movie, and was now curled up on the couch with a book. The only sounds were the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the windows. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. The storm that had been predicted was finally making its presence known. I shivered and pulled the blanket tighter around me, trying to focus on my book. Then I heard it, a loud, deliberate knock on the front door. It was so unexpected that I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Who would be knocking at this hour? I waited, hoping I had imagined it, but the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Slowly I got up from the couch, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was a neighbor in need of help, or perhaps someone stranded by the storm. I approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. The porch light cast a dim glow, but there was no one there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. There was no response, only the sound of the wind and rain pounding against the house. I waited a moment longer, then reluctantly turned the deadbolt and opened the door a crack. The porch was empty, the street beyond it dark and deserted. I stepped outside, feeling the cold rain on my skin as I looked around. The wind whipped through the trees, creating an eerie symphony of rustling leaves and creaking branches. Shivering, I stepped back inside and closed the door, double-checking the lock. I returned to the couch, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. I told myself it was just kids playing a prank or my mind playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched lingered, and I couldn't focus on my book. A few minutes later, the knock came again, more urgent this time. My heart pounded as I approached the door, my hands trembling. I checked the peephole once more, but saw nothing. This time, I didn't open the door. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty house. There was no answer, but I heard a faint shuffling noise, like someone moving just out of sight. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining the situation in a hushed, frantic whisper. They assured me an officer would be on the way and told me to stay inside. I sat on the couch, clutching my phone like a lifeline, my eyes fixed on the front door. The minutes stretched into an eternity, and the storm outside grew fiercer. The wind howled, and the rain hammered against the windows. Suddenly, the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. I fumbled for the flashlight I kept in the drawer, the beam slicing through the blackness. The silence was deafening, broken only by the relentless pounding of the rain. I heard a noise behind me, a soft, almost imperceptible creak. I spun around, the flashlight beam dancing across the walls. The house was empty, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I moved cautiously, checking each room, my heart racing. As I entered the hallway, I saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the end, barely visible in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat as I shone the flashlight directly at it, but the figure disappeared, melting into the darkness. Panic set in, and I ran back to the living room, my mind screaming for a way out. The front door was still locked, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. I felt trapped, surrounded by unseen eyes. Then, the knocking started again, this time from the back door. It was slow and deliberate, each knock a sharp, piercing sound that sent chills down my spine. I knew I had to get out, but every exit felt like a trap. Gathering all my courage, I decided to make a run for it. I grabbed my keys and my phone and bolted for the front door. As I reached it, the knocking grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was outside knew I was trying to escape. I flung the door open and ran into the storm, the rain blinding me as I stumbled down the steps. I didn't stop to look back, I just ran, my feet pounding against the wet pavement. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and relentless, matching my pace. I reached the end of the cul-de-sac and turned onto the main road, hoping to see the headlights of the police car. But the street was empty, and the footsteps were getting closer. I darted into the woods, branches scratching at my face and clothes as I pushed through the undergrowth. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to keep moving. The footsteps followed, never faltering, always just behind me. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. Finally, I burst into a clearing and saw the lights of a house in the distance. I ran towards it, my last hope for safety. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but there was no answer. The house was dark and silent. Desperation took over, and I tried the door. It was unlocked, and I stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. I collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath, my body trembling with fear. The house was empty, abandoned, but it felt safer than the darkness outside. I found a corner to hide in, clutching my flashlight like a weapon. The knocking had stopped, but I knew it was still out there, waiting. I stayed there, too afraid to move, until the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows. The storm had passed and the world outside seemed calm and serene, but I knew the terror wasn't over. When the police finally found me, I was a trembling mess, barely able to speak. They searched the area but found no sign of the figure that had pursued me. They chalked it up to my imagination, a result of fear and panic in the storm, but I knew the truth. I knew that whatever had been knocking on my door was still out there, waiting for another chance. And I knew that no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, I would never truly be safe. The knocking would follow me, a relentless reminder of the night my sanctuary became my prison. In the quaint town of Eldridge Falls, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, the Penrose house stood as a testament to a bygone era. Once a grand estate, it had fallen into disrepair, its history marred by tragedy and rumors of paranormal activity. Despite its foreboding reputation, or perhaps because of it, the Thompson family, drawn by the lure of isolation and the promise of a new beginning, decided to call it home. The first few nights were uneventful, the only disturbances, the creaking of old wood and the whisper of wind through broken panes. But as the days passed, a sense of unease began to permeate the house, a feeling that they were not alone. Objects would move on their own, disappearing only to reappear in impossible places. Cold spots would manifest in the dead of night, their chill seeping into bones and breath. The children, Lily and Max, spoke of a man they called the Watcher, a figure that appeared in the corners of their vision, always just out of sight. They said he was searching for something, his presence a shadow that chilled the air and left an unspoken threat hanging in the silence. Sarah and David Thompson tried to dismiss these occurrences as the product of overactive imaginations and the natural quirks of an old house. But denial became impossible when the whispers started. At first, they thought it was the wind, a trick of the mind in the stillness of night. But the whispers grew louder, forming words that slithered into their thoughts, a litany of sorrow and rage that spoke of betrayal and a buried secret. Determined to uncover the truth and put an end to the haunting, Sarah delved into the history of the Penrose house. She learned of its original owner, Jonathan Penrose, a man whose life was marked by loss and whose death remained shrouded in mystery. It was said he had vanished without a trace, his spirit bound to the house, forever searching for peace. Armed with this knowledge, the Thompsons sought the help of a medium, hoping to contact Jonathan's spirit and resolve the unrest that plagued their home. The séance was held on a stormy night, the air charged with electricity, as if the very atmosphere anticipated the breach of realms. The medium, a woman of advanced years and sharp eyes, called out to Jonathan, her voice a bridge between the living and the dead. The candles flickered, the shadows deepened, and then he appeared, not as the man he once was, but as a specter of grief and fury. He spoke of a hidden grave, of a love betrayed, and of a curse that bound him to the house, his unrest a poison that seeped into the foundation. The revelation was a catalyst, a key that unlocked the darkness held within the walls of the Penrose house. The paranormal activity intensified, no longer confined to whispers and cold spots, but manifesting as poltergeist phenomena that terrorized the family. Objects flew with lethal intent, doors slammed with unseen force, and the figure of the watcher became a constant, malevolent presence. In a desperate bid to end the haunting, the Thompsons unearthed Jonathan's hidden grave, located in a forgotten corner of the property. Beneath a twisted oak, they found his remains, along with a locket that contained a portrait of a woman, the woman he had loved and whose betrayal had led to his demise. They gave Jonathan a proper burial, hoping to grant him the peace he had been denied. For a brief moment, the house was still, the air cleared of the oppressive energy that had suffocated them. But peace was not to be theirs. The haunting did not end with Jonathan's burial. Instead, it was as if a door had been opened, unleashing a torrent of spirits bound to the house by their own tragedies, each a link in a chain of sorrow that the Penrose house had collected over the years. The Thompsons fled the house, leaving behind the dreams of a new beginning. The Penrose house stands empty to this day, a monument to the unseen, a place where the veil between worlds is thin and the echoes of the past whisper in the shadows. And sometimes on stormy nights, when the wind howls through the broken panes, you can hear the sound of a swing creaking in the attic, a remnant of a life cut short, and the whispers of the watcher, forever searching, forever bound to the cursed grounds of the Penrose house. Every night, as the world outside my window succumbed to the embrace of darkness, my room became a stage for the inexplicable and the unnerving. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, with the sense that I was not alone, that the shadows which danced along the walls in the moonlight concealed something far more sinister than mere absence of light. At first, I convinced myself it was the product of an overactive imagination, the result of too many horror stories consumed in the dead of night. But as the days bled into weeks, the occurrences in my bedroom became impossible to dismiss as mere figments of my imagination. It started with the whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that would caress my ears in the dead of night, coaxing me from the precipice of sleep into a state of heightened awareness. I would sit up, heart pounding in the silence that followed, straining to catch the words that seemed to evaporate the moment consciousness took hold. But the meaning remained elusive, the voices a puzzle with no solution. Then came the movements. Objects in my room began to rearrange themselves as if guided by unseen hands. Books would fall from shelves without cause, their pages fluttering open to reveal words that seemed to shimmer in the darkness, forming messages that made no sense, yet filled me with an inexplicable dread. Photographs turned, faces becoming obscured by shadows that had no source, their expressions twisted into silent screams. I tried to seek help, to share my experiences with others, but the words died on my lips, choked by a fear that I was losing my grip on reality. The more I attempted to ignore the occurrences, the more aggressive they became. The whispers turned to voices, loud and demanding, their words now clear, each utterance a prophecy of doom that I could not escape. The climax of this torment came on a night like any other. The air in my room had grown cold, a chill that seemed to seep into my very bones. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as I awaited the nightly performance. But what came was not what I expected. The room darkened as if a cloud had passed over the moon, and from the corners of my vision I saw it, a shadow, darker than the night itself, moving with a purpose. It crept along the walls, its form shifting, growing, until it stood at the foot of my bed, a figure cloaked in darkness. I could not move, could not scream, my body held in place by a terror that surpassed all understanding. The figure leaned forward, its features obscured, but its eyes, oh, its eyes, burned with a light that was not of this world. They pierced me, reading my very soul, and in them I saw my end. It spoke then, its voice a cacophony of every whisper I had ever heard, a sound that filled the room, that filled my mind, leaving no room for doubt or denial. "You are mine," it said, each word a sentence to a fate I could not comprehend. I awoke the next morning, or at least, I believed it to be morning, for the darkness had not lifted. The room remained shrouded in an eternal night, the windows revealing not the world outside but a void, an abyss that stared back at me. I tried to leave, to escape the room that had become my prison, but the door would not budge, the walls impervious to my pleas for release. I was trapped, a pawn in a game that had no end, the room a cell for my soul. Days, weeks, months passed, or so I believe, for time has no meaning in this place. The figure visits me still, its presence a constant reminder of my despair. The voices never cease, their words a litany of horrors yet to come. I write this now not as a warning, for it is too late for me, but as a testament to the reality that exists in the shadows, to the entities that dwell just beyond our sight. My room, once a sanctuary, is now a tomb, and I, its eternal inhabitant, bound to the darkness, forever alone with the voices and the figure that claimed me as its own. The family cabin, nestled in the dense, shadow-draped woods of northern Maine, had always been a place of mystery. Passed down through generations, it held the whispers of the past within its aged, creaking walls. My family seldom spoke of it, and when they did, it was with a mix of reverence and fear. This summer, driven by a desire to explore my heritage, I decided to visit the cabin alone, unaware of the darkness that lurked within. Arriving under the cloak of twilight, the cabin seemed to stand as a defiant relic against the encroaching darkness of the woods. Its windows were like blank, staring eyes, and the door creaked on its hinges as I pushed it open, stepping into a silence so profound it felt almost tangible. The first night passed uneasily. Shadows seemed to flicker and dance in the periphery of my vision, disappearing when I turned to look at them directly. The wind whispered through the trees, a sound that seemed almost like voices speaking in a language just beyond my comprehension. I attributed it to the isolation and the unsettling stories I'd been told, resolving to explore the cabin in the daylight. By day, the cabin revealed its secrets slowly. In the attic, I found a collection of old journals, their pages yellowed with age, the writings of my ancestors who had lived in the cabin through the decades. As I read, a picture began to form, a history of unexplained occurrences, of shadows that moved of their own accord, and of a presence that seemed to inhabit the cabin, an entity that was not bound by the laws of the living. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. The entity, whatever it was, had been a part of the cabin for as long as my family had owned it, a guardian of sorts, but one whose intentions were not benevolent. The journals spoke of rituals performed to appease it, of offerings left in the attic, a tradition that had been abandoned in recent generations. Feeling a growing sense of dread, I decided to leave, to abandon my quest for understanding and return to the safety of the known. But the cabin, it seemed, had other plans. That night, the shadows grew bold, coalescing into the form of a figure, dark and indistinct, that watched me from the corners of the room. The whispers in the wind grew louder, forming words that called my name, urging me to ascend to the attic. Driven by a force I could not resist, I found myself standing before the attic door, the old journals clutched in my hand. As I opened the door, the air grew cold, a chill that seemed to seep into my very soul. Inside, the remnants of the rituals described in the journals were laid out before me, a macabre tableau that spoke of desperation and fear. The figure from the shadows appeared before me, its form more defined now, a being of darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it. It spoke in a voice that was a chorus of the whispers I had heard, telling me of the pact made by my ancestors, a pact that had been broken by my family's abandonment of the cabin. I realized then the true nature of my heritage, a legacy of darkness bound to the cabin, a guardian that demanded tribute. The entity before me was the keeper of that pact, and it had chosen me to renew the bond, to ensure the continuation of the agreement that had been struck so many years before. I tried to flee, to escape the attic and the cabin, but the door would not open, the windows would not break. I was trapped, a prisoner chosen by the darkness to fulfill a role I had never wanted. The cabin remains in my family's name, but it stands empty now, a place shunned and feared. And I, bound to the cabin by the pact of my ancestors, remain its keeper, forever watching from the shadows, the whisper in the wind, a part of the darkness that inhabits the old family cabin in the woods. The sleepover at Kara's house was supposed to be the highlight of our summer, a break from the monotony of small-town life, a night of movies, junk food, and ghost stories. Kara's house, an imposing structure at the edge of town, surrounded by dense woods, had always fascinated and unnerved us in equal measure. It was the perfect setting for a night of spooky fun, or so we thought. As night fell, the house seemed to take on a life of its own. Shadows danced along the walls, and the wind howled through the trees like whispers of the night. We gathered in the living room, the flickering light of candles casting eerie shapes, and began to share ghost stories, each tale more unnerving than the last. It was during one such story, a tale of a vengeful spirit haunting the very woods surrounding Kara's house, that we first heard it, a soft, insistent tapping at the window. We froze, our laughter dying in our throats. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, as if whatever was outside sought entry. Kara, always the bravest among us, approached the window, her movements hesitant. She pulled back the curtain, revealing nothing but the darkness beyond. The tapping ceased, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Relieved yet unsettled, we tried to laugh it off, to return to our tales and treats, but the atmosphere had shifted, the shadows seeming to close in around us. We decided to move our sleepover to Kara's room, seeking the comfort of light and company. As we settled in, our conversation light and filled with nervous laughter, the tapping began anew, this time at the bedroom door. It was more insistent, more demanding. Frozen in fear, we watched as the doorknob turned slowly, the door creaking open to reveal the darkened hallway beyond, empty and silent. Panic took hold, a sense of dread enveloping us as we realized we were not alone in the house. The tapping turned to scratching, a sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves, encircling us, drawing closer. Whispers filled the air, voices that were not our own, speaking words we could not understand. In a moment of desperation, Kara suggested we try to communicate, to ask what the spirit wanted. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We sat in a circle, hands joined, and called out into the darkness. The response was immediate, a cold gust of wind that extinguished the candles, plunging us into darkness. The whispers grew louder, converging into a single voice that spoke my name. It knew me, knew things about me that I had never shared. It spoke of secrets buried deep, of darkness within that mirrored its own. The fear was overwhelming, a physical presence that threatened to suffocate me. We broke the circle, scrambling for the lights, for the door, for any escape from the nightmare that Kara's house had become. But the house seemed to twist and turn against us, hallways stretching into infinity, doors leading nowhere. We were trapped, the spirit no longer just a whisper but a howl of rage and despair, closing in. It was then that Kara revealed the truth, a truth she had kept hidden even from herself. The house had been the site of a tragedy, a family torn apart by loss and darkness, a darkness that had never left. In the end, it was the house that claimed us. One by one, we were consumed by the shadows, our screams echoing in the night, unheard beyond the walls of Kara's house. I alone remained, a witness to the horror, my friends nothing but memories swallowed by the darkness. The sun rose on an empty house, the shadows receding but never fully vanishing. Kara's house stands still, a monument to the night of terror we experienced. And I, forever changed, carry the weight of that night, a survivor of the sleepover that turned into a nightmare, a living testament to the paranormal activity that lurks in the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to cross its threshold. Eager for a thrill, five friends decided to spend a night in the Ashen Hotel, a once grand establishment now abandoned and rumored to be haunted. The hotel, with its decaying elegance and air of forgotten stories, stood isolated on the outskirts of their small town, a relic of the past that few dared to approach. Armed with flashlights and a sense of invincibility, Alex, Casey, Jamie, Nora, and Sam broke through the rusted gate under the cover of darkness. The hotel loomed above them, its broken windows like dark, watching eyes, and its silent facade a challenge to their bravado. As they entered the lobby, their lights revealed peeling wallpaper, shattered glass, and the debris of years of neglect. Laughter and jokes filled the air, a mask for the unease that settled in their stomachs. They explored the ground floor, daring each other to venture into the darker corners, each step taking them further into the heart of the hotel. The night's entertainment began with a game of hide-and-seek, the hotel's vast, empty rooms providing the perfect backdrop. Alex was it, counting loudly as the others scattered, their footsteps echoing through the silent corridors. The game took a turn when Alex found Casey, not hiding, but standing frozen in the hallway, staring at something unseen. Casey whispered of a shadow that moved on its own, of whispers that filled the air, but Alex saw nothing. Shaken, they decided to regroup, the thrill of their adventure souring. As they searched for the others, the hotel seemed to shift around them, hallways stretching and doors disappearing, their familiarity with the layout unraveling. Panic rose when they found Nora, her flashlight flickering, her eyes wide with fear as she spoke of seeing her own reflection age and decay in a mirror that was now inexplicably missing. The group's resolve crumbled, the desire to leave growing urgent, but Sam and Jamie were still missing. Calls for their friends went unanswered, the hotel swallowing their voices. They split up, desperation driving them deeper into the hotel's embrace. Alex found Jamie in the ballroom, staring transfixed at the center of the dance floor where the dust swirled and gathered into the form of dancers waltzing to silent music, their forms transparent and shifting. Jamie couldn't look away, mesmerized by the spectacle, a ghostly recreation of the hotel's past glories. Casey and Nora discovered Sam in the basement, locked in a storage room, his voice hoarse from screaming for help. He spoke of feeling hands grasp at him in the dark, of a suffocating presence that whispered of untold horrors. They regrouped, determined to find an exit, but the hotel was no longer the place they had entered. The architecture mocked them, an ever-changing maze designed to confuse and entrap. Hours passed, their flashlights dimming, the darkness growing bolder. In a final, desperate bid for freedom, they found themselves in the lobby once more, the front door visible across the room. Relief was short-lived as the chandeliers above came to life, illuminating the lobby in a harsh, unnatural light. Before them, the shadows gathered, coalescing into a singular dark figure that radiated an ancient, cold anger. It spoke in a voice that echoed through the halls, a sound that seemed to come from the very walls of the hotel itself. It told of betrayal, of a grave injustice that had condemned it to the hotel, of a hunger for the living that had gone unsatisfied for too long. The friends realized too late the true nature of the Ashen Hotel. It was a prison, a tomb for something unspeakable, and they had willingly walked into its grasp. As the figure advanced, they understood that escape was impossible. The hotel desired more than to scare. It sought to consume, to claim them as its own. Their screams echoed through the night, a final testament to their fate. The Ashen Hotel stood silent once more, its hunger momentarily appeased, waiting for the next unwary souls to breach its threshold. In the town, the disappearance of the five friends became yet another tale whispered about the hotel, a cautionary story of curiosity and the darkness that dwells in forgotten places. The hotel remains, its secrets unspoken, its appetite endless. The storm had come out of nowhere, a sudden deluge that turned the roads into rivers and forced Jacob to seek refuge for the night. The only shelter for miles was an old hotel perched at the edge of a cliff overlooking the churning sea below. Its sign, battered by the wind, read, "The Cliffside Inn," the letters flickering in the storm's fury. Inside, the hotel was a maze of corridors and staircases, adorned with faded wallpaper and portraits, whose eyes seemed to follow Jacob as he passed. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and decay, a tangible reminder of the building's age and its battle against the elements. The innkeeper, a gaunt figure with hollow cheeks and eyes too sharp, handed Jacob the key to room 13, a smile curling his lips that did not reach his eyes. The room was small, the wallpaper peeling, the single window offering a view of the storm-ravaged sea. Jacob tried to settle in, but unease gnawed at him, a feeling of being watched. As night deepened, the storm outside grew more violent, the wind howling like a banshee's wail. It began with a whisper, so faint Jacob thought he imagined it, a soft murmur lost in the storm's cacophony. But then it came again, clearer this time, his name being called from the shadows. The temperature dropped, his breath visible in the air, as he searched the room for the source of the voice. The whispers grew into voices, a chorus of them, speaking in languages he couldn't understand. The portraits in the hall seemed to come alive, their expressions twisted in agony, their eyes pleading for release. Jacob tried to leave, but the door to his room wouldn't budge, the windows sealed shut against his efforts. Panic set in as the voices converged into a single, terrifying scream, the sound filling the room, vibrating in his bones. Shadows danced along the walls, forming shapes that were almost human, reaching out to him with fingers made of darkness. And then, silence. A silence so profound it pressed against his ears, a harbinger of something far worse. From the bathroom, water began to run, spilling over the edges of the sink, the liquid black as ink. Drawn by a force he couldn't resist, Jacob approached, the mirror above the sink reflecting not his own image, but a tableau of horror. The room behind him was filled with the apparitions from the hall, their bodies contorted, eyes empty sockets, mouths agape in silent screams. In the mirror, the innkeeper's reflection stood behind Jacob, his smile wide and grotesque. "The Cliffside Inn thanks you for your stay," he whispered, his voice a knife's edge. "Your soul will keep us company for eternity." Jacob spun around, but the room was empty, the apparitions gone. The storm outside had ceased, the first light of dawn creeping through the cracks of the sealed window. Exhausted and terrified, he collapsed, the events of the night a nightmare from which he could not awaken. When the police found him the next day, Jacob was catatonic, his eyes staring at something only he could see. The Cliffside Inn was empty, abandoned for decades, its walls crumbling, the portraits faded and covered in dust. No innkeeper, no guests, only the sea's mournful cry echoing through the empty halls. Jacob never recovered, his mind trapped in that night of horror. The Cliffside Inn remains, a beacon for the lost and the weary, its true nature hidden behind a veneer of normalcy. But those who stay, drawn by the storm or by fate, find themselves part of its history, their screams added to the chorus that haunts the halls, their souls never leaving, forever guests of the Cliffside Inn. On a whim, drawn by tales of its haunting beauty and tragic past, I booked a stay at the Grand Heirloom Hotel, nestled in the heart of a forgotten coastal town. Its reputation for being haunted was a lure for a writer like me, seeking inspiration in the embrace of the macabre. The hotel, a towering edifice of crumbling elegance, whispered secrets through its cracked facade and broken windows, a siren call to those who listened. Room 413 was to be my sanctuary, a place to immerse myself in writing, untouched by the world outside. The room, however, had plans of its own. From the moment I crossed its threshold, a sense of unease settled over me, the air thick with the scent of decay masked by the heavy perfume of old roses. As night descended, the hotel transformed. The walls of my room seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding in a rhythm that mirrored my own heartbeat. Shadows danced in the corners of my vision, shapes that twisted and morphed in the dim light, always just beyond my grasp. I told myself it was the trickery of an exhausted mind, the consequences of too many nights spent chasing tales of ghosts and ghouls. But then came the knocking. A soft, persistent sound that echoed in the silence of the night, always 3 knocks, always from the same place, the window overlooking the storm-tossed sea. Each night I would rise, compelled to answer, but found nothing save for the reflection of a room that seemed to age with each passing hour, its walls closing in, the space growing smaller, more oppressive. Sleep became a rare commodity, snatched in moments between the knocking and the ever-present feeling of being watched. The hotel's corridors, once a source of fascination, became a maze of fear, the portraits on the walls watching my descent into madness with eyes that knew too much. My writing, once a source of joy, turned to frantic scribbles of a mind unraveling, the words a jumble of fears and warnings, of shadows that whispered in the night and walls that moved with a purpose I could not understand. I attempted to leave, to escape the suffocating embrace of room 413, but the hotel would not release its hold. Corridors twisted back upon themselves, staircases led nowhere, and every door I opened led back to my room, to the waiting shadows and the relentless knocking. In my final hours, as the walls closed in, the room shrinking to a point where I could barely breathe, I understood the true horror of the Grand Heirloom Hotel. It was alive, a creature of wood and stone, fed by the fears and madness of its guests. Room 413 was its heart, a place where reality bent and broke, where the shadows feasted on the minds of those who dared to stay. The knocking was a countdown, a herald of the end. When I answered for the last time, the window revealed not the stormy sea but a void, a darkness that pulsed with the hunger of the hotel. And as I stepped forward, drawn by a force beyond my control, I realized that the hotel had never intended to let me leave. I was to be a part of it, my madness a thread woven into its fabric, my soul trapped within its walls forever. The Grand Heirloom Hotel stands still, its rooms waiting, the shadows hungry, and in room 413, the walls move in the darkness, the window knocks, and the sea whispers tales of those who came seeking inspiration, only to find insanity. And somewhere, in a room that breathes and watches, the scribbled words of a lost writer flutter to the floor, a warning unread, as the door swings open, welcoming the next guest. Nestled in a forgotten corner of the countryside, shrouded in fog and surrounded by the wild, untamed beauty of nature, stood the Heartwood Hotel. It was a relic of a bygone era, its once grand facade now weathered by time, its walls whispering tales of the past. Despite its isolation and the rumors that clung to it like cobwebs, the hotel continued to welcome the occasional traveler, drawn by a curiosity for the unknown or a desire to escape the world. Simon, a writer in search of solitude and inspiration, was one such traveler. The Heartwood, with its history and secluded location, seemed the perfect place to lose himself in his work, away from the distractions of the city. He arrived one stormy evening, the hotel emerging from the mist like a scene from a novel, its lights a beacon in the darkness. The interior was a time capsule, each room meticulously preserved, the air heavy with the scent of aged wood and old books. The owner, a man named Mr. Winters, was an enigmatic figure, his eyes holding stories untold, his welcome warm yet somehow distant. Simon was the hotel's only guest, a fact that filled him with a sense of unease that he couldn't quite place. As night fell, Simon explored the hotel, his footsteps echoing in the silent corridors, the portraits on the walls watching him pass. It was then he heard it, the sound of a piano playing softly, the melody haunting, filled with a sorrow that tugged at his heart. Drawn to the music, Simon found himself in the hotel's grand ballroom, the piano playing of its own accord, the room empty. Fascinated and unnerved, Simon mentioned the piano to Mr. Winters, who simply smiled, his eyes clouded with a nostalgia that spoke of loss. "The hotel has many secrets, Mr. Simon. Some are better left undiscovered," he said, leaving Simon with more questions than answers. That night, Simon awoke to the sound of laughter and music, as if the hotel had come alive with the echoes of a time long past. The ballroom, he discovered, was filled with apparitions, guests dancing in a celebration that had no place in the present, their forms flickering like candlelight, unaware of Simon's presence. Each night, the hotel revealed more of its secrets to Simon. Hallways that led to rooms that shouldn't exist, doors that opened to reveal brick walls, and always the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Simon's writing, once the purpose of his stay, was forgotten, replaced by an obsession with uncovering the truth of the Heartwood Hotel. Driven by a need to understand, Simon confronted Mr. Winters, demanding answers. The owner's demeanor changed, the warmth replaced by a cold resignation. "You seek answers, Mr. Simon, but are you prepared for the truth?" With those words, Mr. Winters led Simon to a part of the hotel that seemed untouched by time, to a door that had remained locked, its secrets untold. Behind the door lay the heart of the Heartwood, a room where the veil between the past and the present was at its thinnest, where the hotel's memories were stored, alive and pulsating with energy. "The hotel is a keeper of stories, Mr. Simon," Mr. Winters explained. "Every guest leaves a piece of themselves behind, their joys, their sorrows, their very essence, and some never leave at all." It was then that Simon understood. The apparitions, the music, the shifting hallways, they were all manifestations of the hotel's memories, trapped within its walls. And as the realization dawned on him, the door closed, sealing him inside. Simon became a part of the Heartwood, his story woven into the fabric of the hotel, his presence just another whisper in the corridors. Mr. Winters, the keeper of stories, continued to welcome the occasional traveler, the Heartwood Hotel standing timeless, a monument to the past and a prison for those who dared to uncover its secrets. And Simon, forever trapped within its walls, wrote his tales in the shadows, his voice joining the chorus of the hotel's eternal guests, his longing for escape, a note in the haunting melody that played in the ballroom, a melody that echoed in the night, calling to those who listened. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the rough, splintered wood beneath me and the pungent smell of hay mixed with something metallic and foul. I groaned and sat up, every muscle in my body protesting. My head throbbed with a deep, pulsing ache, and I had to blink several times before my vision cleared. I was in an old barn, dimly lit by the light streaming through the gaps in the wooden walls. Dust motes floated in the air, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I tried to remember how I got here, but my mind was a blank slate. Panic began to creep in as I realized I had no memory of who I was or why I was here. I stood up unsteadily, brushing off bits of hay clinging to my clothes. As I looked around, my eyes fell on a piece of paper lying on the ground a few feet away. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The paper was old and yellowed, the edges frayed. Written on it in neat, precise handwriting were names I didn't recognize: Marcus Wells, Emma Harper, David Connor, Lucy Brandt. Each name was crossed out with a single, bold line. I stared at the list, a sense of dread settling in my stomach. Why was I here with this list? What did it mean? I folded the paper and stuffed it into my pocket, feeling a sudden urge to get out of the barn. I approached the large wooden doors and pushed them open. They creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty space. Outside, the world was still and quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the overgrown fields. I stepped out into the open, looking around for any sign of life. The barn was isolated, surrounded by nothing but fields and a dense forest in the distance. I started walking towards the tree line, hoping to find a road or a house where I could get help. As I made my way through the tall grass, I noticed more details about my surroundings. The barn looked like it hadn't been used in years, its roof sagging and the paint peeling. The fields were overgrown, wildflowers and weeds overtaking what might have once been crops. I reached the edge of the forest and hesitated. The trees were dark and foreboding, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sunlight. But there was nowhere else to go. I took a deep breath and stepped into the woods. The air grew cooler as I walked, the sounds of my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of leaves on the ground. I followed a narrow path, my heart pounding with each step. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood an old, decrepit house, its windows shattered and the door hanging off its hinges. The sight of it filled me with an inexplicable sense of dread, but I had no other choice. I needed to find out who I was and why I was here. I approached the house cautiously, the floorboards creaking under my weight as I stepped onto the porch. I pushed the door open and entered, the smell of mold and decay overwhelming. The interior was in disarray, furniture overturned and debris scattered across the floor. I made my way through the house, searching for anything that might give me answers. In the living room, I found a dusty old photo album on a table. I opened it, my heart racing as I flipped through the pages. The photos were old and faded, but I could make out the faces of the people in them. A family, smiling and happy, but their faces meant nothing to me. I didn't recognize any of them. As I closed the album, a piece of paper fell out from between the pages. I picked it up and unfolded it, my blood running cold as I read the names on the list. Marcus Wells, Emma Harper, David Connor, Lucy Brandt, Jonathan Moore. My name was the last one on the list, and it wasn't crossed out. Panic surged through me. Why was my name here? What had happened to the others? I needed to get out of this house, to find help before it was too late. I turned to leave, but a movement in the corner of the room caught my eye. A figure stood in the shadows, watching me. My heart skipped a beat as the figure stepped into the light, revealing a gaunt, hollow-eyed man. His clothes were tattered, and he looked like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice raspy and weak. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It doesn't matter. You need to leave before they come back." "Who's coming back?" I asked, but the man didn't answer. He turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving me alone with my fear. I ran out of the house, my mind racing. I didn't know who I was or what had happened, but I knew I needed to get as far away from here as possible. I sprinted through the forest, the trees closing in around me. The names on the list haunted me, their fates unknown. As I burst through the trees and into the open fields, I saw headlights in the distance. A car was approaching, its lights cutting through the dusk. I waved my arms, desperate for help. The car slowed and stopped, a man stepping out. Relief washed over me as I approached, but it quickly turned to terror as I recognized his face. It was the same gaunt man from the house, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "You can't escape," he said, his voice echoing in my mind. I turned to run, but it was too late. Hands grabbed me from behind, pulling me into the darkness. The last thing I saw was the piece of paper fluttering to the ground, the names crossed out one by one, until only mine remained. I woke up with a start, my head pounding and my vision blurry. The first thing I noticed was the sharp, metallic scent of blood. My clothes were soaked with it, dark stains spreading across my shirt and jeans. Panic surged through me as I struggled to remember what had happened. I was in my car, slumped over the steering wheel, parked on the side of a desolate road. The last thing I remembered was driving home from a late shift at work. I had been exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open. But now, I had no recollection of how I ended up here or why I was covered in blood. My heart raced as I frantically checked myself for injuries, but I found none. The blood wasn't mine. I sat up, wincing at the stiffness in my muscles, and looked around. The road was deserted, lined with dense, dark woods on either side. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. My phone was nowhere to be found, and the clock on the dashboard was frozen at 3:13 a.m. My hands trembled as I reached for the ignition, but the car wouldn't start. The engine made a sickening, grinding noise before falling silent. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere with no way to call for help. I needed to get out of the car to find out where I was and what had happened. I opened the door and stepped into the cool night air, my legs unsteady beneath me. The blood on my clothes felt sticky and cold, clinging to my skin. I tried to steady my breathing as I scanned the area, looking for any sign of life. There was nothing but the oppressive silence of the woods and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I took a few hesitant steps away from the car, my eyes straining to see through the darkness. My foot hit something solid, and I stumbled, nearly falling. I looked down and saw a large, dark shape lying on the ground. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was a body. The person was face down, their clothes soaked with blood. A wave of nausea washed over me as I backed away, my mind racing with questions. Who were they? And why were they here with me? I needed to know what had happened, but the fear and confusion were overwhelming. I forced myself to approach the body, my heart pounding in my ears. With trembling hands, I turned them over, revealing a man in his 40s, his face pale and lifeless. There was a deep gash on his forehead, and his eyes stared blankly at the sky. I recoiled, my stomach heaving. I had to get away from here to find help. But as I turned to leave, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. My blood ran cold and I froze, straining to listen. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and thin, with a face that seemed to blend into the darkness. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their eyes locked onto mine. I felt a chill run down my spine as they approached, their presence unsettling and otherworldly. I took a step back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body refused to obey. The figure stopped a few feet away, their gaze never wavering. "You shouldn't be here," they said, their voice low and hollow. "This place is not meant for you." "I don't understand," I stammered, my voice shaking. "What happened? Who is that man?" The figure tilted their head slightly, as if considering my question. "You must leave before it's too late." Before I could respond, the figure turned and disappeared back into the woods, leaving me alone with the body and the weight of their warning. I didn't know what to do, but staying here felt like a death sentence. I forced myself to move, my legs finally responding to the surge of adrenaline. I stumbled back to the car, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I had to find help, to figure out what had happened. But the car was dead, and I was stranded in the middle of nowhere. With no other options, I started walking down the road, the oppressive silence pressing in on me from all sides. The moon cast long shadows on the pavement, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting the figure to reappear, but the road remained empty. After what felt like hours, I saw a faint light in the distance. My heart leapt with hope, and I quickened my pace, desperate for any sign of civilization. As I drew closer, I realized it was a small gas station, its neon sign flickering in the night. I burst through the door, startling the attendant behind the counter. He looked up from his magazine, his eyes widening as he took in my blood-soaked clothes and wild expression. "Please, you have to help me," I gasped, my voice trembling. "There's a body on the road, and I don't know what happened." The attendant's face went pale, and he reached for the phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. I collapsed into a chair, my mind reeling. The minutes stretched into an eternity as we waited for the police to arrive. When they finally did, I recounted my story as best as I could, my memory still fragmented and unclear. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions grim. "We'll take you to the station," one of them said. "We'll figure this out." As they led me to the squad car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The figure's warning echoed in my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder if I had stumbled into something far beyond my understanding. At the station, they questioned me for hours, but I had no answers to give. My memory was a blank, and the fear and confusion only grew stronger. As dawn broke, they finally let me go, with no more information than I had started with. I returned home, but the unease never left me. The image of the lifeless body, the figure in the woods, and the blood on my clothes haunted my every waking moment. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. And then one night, I woke to the sound of whispering. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and saw the figure standing at the foot of my bed, their eyes locked onto mine. "You didn't leave," they said, their voice filled with a chilling finality. "Now it's too late." The room grew cold, and the shadows seemed to close in around me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing I saw was the figure's eyes, glowing in the darkness, before everything went black. When they found me the next morning, I was slumped over in my bed. My heart stopped. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but I knew the truth. The figure had come for me, just as they had warned. And now I was trapped in the darkness, forever haunted by the unanswered questions and the terror that had claimed my life. When I woke up, my head was pounding, and the room was spinning. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the dim light filtering through the curtains. My bedroom, usually a safe haven, felt unfamiliar and sinister. As I sat up, a metallic scent hit my nose, and my heart sank. Blood. There was blood everywhere, on the sheets, the walls, even splattered across the ceiling. Panic surged through me. I had no memory of what had happened or how I had ended up in this nightmare. My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of my shattered memory, but there was nothing but a black void. I had to get rid of the blood, to clean up before anyone saw. But why was there so much? Whose blood was it? I stumbled out of bed, nearly slipping on the slick floor. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the first thing I could find, an old towel, and began scrubbing the floor, my heart hammering in my chest. My reflection in the mirror caught my eye, and I saw the blood smeared on my face and clothes. I looked like a stranger, a figure out of a horror movie. As I worked frantically, I glanced out the window and froze. My neighbor, Mr. Thompson, was standing in his yard, staring directly into my room. His eyes were wide with shock, and he made no move to look away. The intensity of his gaze sent a chill down my spine. I turned away quickly, hoping he hadn't seen too much. I needed to clean up faster. My movements became more frantic, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I couldn't let him call the police. I needed to figure out what had happened first. I stripped the bed, bundling the bloody sheets into a tight ball and shoving them into a trash bag. My hands were slick with blood, and my stomach churned with nausea. I scrubbed the walls, the ceiling, every surface that had been touched by the crimson stains. The task seemed endless, and the room still reeked of blood. Every few minutes, I glanced out the window, and each time, Mr. Thompson was still there watching. His presence unnerved me, but I couldn't stop. I had to erase any trace of the horror that had unfolded in my room. After what felt like hours, the blood was mostly gone, though the room still bore faint, stubborn stains. I stuffed my bloody clothes into another trash bag and hurried to the bathroom to wash myself clean. The water ran red as I scrubbed my hands and face, but no matter how hard I scrubbed, I couldn't shake the feeling of the blood clinging to me. As I stood in front of the mirror, the face staring back at me seemed hollow, haunted. Who had I become? What had I done? My reflection offered no answers, only more questions. A loud knock on the front door jolted me from my thoughts. My heart leaped into my throat. I peered out the bathroom window and saw 2 police officers standing on the porch, Mr. Thompson talking to them urgently. Panic gripped me. He had called them. He had seen too much. I couldn't let them in. I couldn't let them see the remnants of blood I couldn't clean. I grabbed the trash bags and stuffed them into the closet, praying they wouldn't search the house. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I took a deep breath and forced myself to appear calm as I went to the door. My hand shook as I turned the knob, and I opened it just a crack. "Good morning," one of the officers said, his tone serious. "We received a call from your neighbor. He said he saw something unusual." I forced a smile. "Oh, Mr. Thompson? He's always worried about something. What's the problem?" The officer's gaze was piercing. "He mentioned seeing blood in your room. Is everything all right?" My mind raced for an excuse. "I cut myself last night. A bad accident. I didn't realize how much of a mess I made until this morning." The officer's eyes narrowed. "May we come in and take a look?" My heart pounded in my chest. "It's really not necessary. I've cleaned it up, and I'm fine now. Just a little shaken." The other officer stepped forward, his expression stern. "We need to make sure everything is all right, ma'am. Please let us in." I had no choice. Reluctantly, I stepped aside and let them in. They walked through the house, their eyes scanning every corner. I prayed they wouldn't notice the faint stains or the trash bags hidden away. When they reached my bedroom, they paused, their expressions darkening. One of them stepped closer to the wall, examining a spot I hadn't managed to clean thoroughly. "This is a lot of blood for just a cut," he said, his voice skeptical. I was disoriented, I lied, my voice trembling. I panicked and made a mess trying to clean it up. The officers exchanged a glance, and I could feel their suspicion growing. They turned to leave, but before they did, one of them handed me a card. "If you remember anything else, or if you need help, give us a call." I nodded, barely able to breathe until they were gone. As soon as the door closed behind them, I collapsed onto the floor, my body shaking with sobs. I was safe for now, but the fear and confusion still gripped me. I had to find out what had happened. I couldn't live with this darkness hanging over me, this fear that I had done something terrible. I needed answers. That night, I tossed and turned, sleep eluding me. My mind kept replaying the day's events, the blood, the police, Mr. Thompson's accusing stare. As I lay there, a memory began to surface, hazy and fragmented, a fight, voices raised in anger, a flash of metal. the sickening sound of a blade cutting through flesh. I bolted upright in bed, my heart pounding. I had seen a knife, covered in blood, but where? I got up and searched the room, my hands shaking. I found it under the bed, the blade stained with dried blood. As I held the knife, the memory became clearer. An argument with someone, the knife in my hand. The shock and horror as I realized what I had done. My breath came in short gasps as the full weight of my actions hit me. I had killed someone. I didn't know who, but the blood on my clothes, the knife in my hand, it all pointed to one horrifying conclusion. I looked out the window, and there was Mr. Thompson, still watching, his expression unreadable. He knew, he had seen everything. And now, there was no escape from the truth. I was a killer, trapped in my own nightmare, with no way out. The darkness inside me had finally taken over, and there was no going back. As I stared into the night, I knew that this was only the beginning of my descent into madness. When I awoke, it was in total darkness. A chill crept into my bones, and my head throbbed with a dull, persistent pain. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy and unresponsive. Panic began to rise within me as I realized I had no memory of where I was or how I had gotten there. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to calm the racing thoughts that threatened to overwhelm me. Gradually, I managed to sit up, my hands exploring the cold, hard floor beneath me. The surface was rough and damp, sending shivers through my body. I felt around, hoping to find some clue about my surroundings, but there was nothing but the unyielding stone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the darkness. There was no response, only the sound of my own breathing, loud and ragged in the silence. I groped in the darkness, my fingers brushing against what felt like a wall. It was made of cold, smooth stone, and I followed it, hoping it would lead me to a door or some means of escape. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved slowly, the fear of the unknown gnawing at me. After what felt like an eternity, my fingers found a crack in the wall. I traced it, realizing it was a door, or at least some sort of opening. I pushed against it, but it didn't budge. Desperation surged through me, and I pounded on the door, shouting for help. "Is anyone there? Please, let me out!" The silence was deafening. I slumped against the door, my mind racing with questions. Who was I? How had I ended up here? And why couldn't I remember anything? As I sat there, trying to piece together the fragments of my shattered memory, I heard it, a faint, shuffling sound coming from somewhere behind me. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat. The sound grew louder, more distinct, as if someone or something was moving towards me. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. There was no response, only the continued shuffling. I fumbled in the darkness, my hands finding a small, jagged piece of stone. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I held it tightly, ready to defend myself against whatever was approaching. The shuffling stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whisper. I strained to listen, but the words were unintelligible, a chilling murmur that seemed to seep into my very soul. The air grew colder, and I could feel a presence in the room, something unseen but undeniably real. "Show yourself!" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The whispering stopped abruptly, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, without warning, a blinding light filled the room. I shielded my eyes, blinking against the sudden brightness. When my vision cleared, I saw that I was in a small, windowless basement. The walls were lined with shelves, cluttered with old, dusty objects. In the center of the room stood a figure, shrouded in shadows. It was tall and thin, its features hidden by the darkness. The light seemed to emanate from nowhere, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It moved closer, its footsteps echoing in the small space. I tightened my grip on the stone, ready to strike if necessary. As it approached, the shadows seemed to melt away, revealing a face that was both familiar and foreign. It was a man, his eyes hollow and empty, his skin pale and drawn. He looked at me with an expression of sorrow and regret. "You don't remember, do you?" he said, his voice soft and mournful. "Remember what?" I asked, my confusion growing. "Who you are, what you've done." "I don't understand," I said, shaking my head. "I don't remember anything." He sighed a deep, sorrowful sound. "You were trying to forget, to escape the past, but you can't run from your own mind." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my frustration mounting. He stepped closer, his eyes boring into mine. "You wanted to forget the pain, the guilt, so you did something terrible, something unforgivable." A chill ran down my spine. "What did I do?" "You made a deal," he said. "A deal to erase your memories. But the past always catches up, no matter how hard you try to escape it." I shook my head, my mind reeling. "No, that can't be true." "You don't believe me?" he asked, his voice tinged with sadness. "Look around. This is your mind, your prison, and I'm here to make you remember." As he spoke, the room began to change. The walls seemed to close in, the light growing dimmer. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me, and I sank to my knees, clutching my head. Images flashed before my eyes, fragments of memories long buried. I saw myself standing over a body, blood on my hands. I heard screams, felt the weight of guilt and despair crushing me. I had done something terrible, something that I couldn't bear to remember. "No," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't want this." "But you did," the man said. "You chose to forget, to hide from your sins, but now you must face them." The images continued, each one more horrifying than the last. I saw the faces of those I had hurt, their eyes filled with pain and betrayal. I heard their voices accusing me, condemning me. "I can't," I sobbed. "I can't face it." "You have no choice," the man said. "This is your punishment, to remember, to suffer." The light faded completely, plunging me back into darkness. The man's voice echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of my sins. "You can never escape your past. It will always find you." I was left alone, surrounded by the darkness of my own making. The memories flooded back, relentless and unforgiving. I had tried to escape, to erase the pain, but in the end, I had only trapped myself in a prison of my own mind. And there, in the cold, dark basement, I was left to face the horror of my past, knowing that I would never find peace. I awoke suddenly in the dead of night, jolted from a dreamless sleep by a sound that didn't belong. It was a soft, mournful crying, barely audible over the whisper of the wind against the window panes. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay still, straining to listen, hoping that I had imagined it. But the crying continued, a low, pitiful wail that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the house. My house. My empty house. I lived alone, had done so for years, ever since the divorce. There should have been no one else here. I sat up slowly, the old wooden floorboards creaking beneath my weight as I swung my legs over the side of the bed. The room was dark, the faint light of the moon casting long shadows through the gaps in the curtains. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand, 3:07 a.m., the witching hour. The crying grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like a woman, her voice filled with sorrow and despair. I shivered, pulling on a sweater to ward off the chill that seemed to seep through the walls. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to find out where it was coming from. I grabbed the flashlight from my bedside drawer and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The hallway outside my bedroom was empty, the doors to the other rooms closed. I took a deep breath and stepped out, the floor cold beneath my bare feet. The crying seemed to echo through the house, making it difficult to pinpoint its origin. I moved cautiously, my flashlight sweeping across the walls and floor, my heart pounding in my ears. I checked the guest room, the bathroom, even the closets. Nothing. As I approached the staircase, the crying grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from downstairs. I hesitated for a moment, fear gnawing at the edges of my resolve. But curiosity and a strange sense of duty propelled me forward. I had to know. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the beam of my flashlight flickering slightly. The living room was empty, the furniture casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. I paused, listening. The crying was louder now, coming from the direction of the kitchen. I moved slowly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The kitchen was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the flashlight. The crying was louder here, almost deafening. It seemed to come from the pantry, a small room at the back of the kitchen. I approached the pantry door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. The crying was so close now, as if the person was right on the other side. I took a deep breath and flung the door open. the flashlight beam revealing nothing. The pantry was empty, the shelves lined with cans and boxes. The crying stopped abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. I stood there, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of what was happening. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? As I turned to leave, the crying started again, louder than ever, echoing through the small room. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting frantically across the shelves. And then I saw it, a small dark stain on the floor, barely visible in the dim light. It looked like blood. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, my mind racing. What was happening? Who was in my house? The crying grew louder still, filling my ears, drowning out my thoughts. I had to get out. I had to leave. I turned and ran, the flashlight beam bobbing wildly as I fled through the kitchen and into the living room. But as I reached the front door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. I yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The crying was all around me now, a cacophony of sorrow and despair. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it was inside my head, an inescapable torment. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the room, searching for a way out. And then I saw her. She was standing in the corner of the room, her figure barely visible in the dim light. She was dressed in a long, tattered gown, her hair hanging in tangled strands around her face. Her eyes were hollow, empty, and her mouth was twisted in a perpetual expression of grief. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. She just stood there, crying softly, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "Please," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "What do you want?" Her crying stopped abruptly, and she lifted her head, her empty eyes locking onto mine. "You," she said, her voice a hollow echo. "I want you." A chill ran down my spine, and I backed away, my mind racing. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You took everything from me," she said, her voice growing louder, more insistent. "Now it's your turn." The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening around me. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the rug and falling to the floor. The crying started again, louder and more intense, filling the room with its haunting sound. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting around the room for an escape. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn tight. The front door was still locked, the handle refusing to turn. I was trapped. The woman took a step closer, her eyes fixed on mine. "You will suffer as I have suffered," she said, her voice a chilling whisper. "Please," I begged, my voice breaking. "I don't know what you're talking about." She took another step closer, her figure becoming clearer in the dim light. "You took my life," she said, her voice filled with a cold fury. "Now I will take yours." Panic surged through me, and I backed away, my mind racing. I had to get out. I had to escape. I turned and ran towards the back door, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I reached the kitchen, the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. The crying grew louder, more intense, echoing through the house. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it was inside my head, an inescapable torment. I backed away, my eyes darting around the room, searching for a way out. And then I felt it, a cold, clammy hand gripping my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. The crying grew louder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I was trapped, alone in the house with a vengeful spirit. The woman's figure appeared in front of me, her hollow eyes filled with fury. "You will suffer as I have suffered," she said, her voice a chilling whisper. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the living room, the morning light streaming through the windows. The house was silent, the oppressive feeling of dread lifted. I sat up slowly, my head pounding. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination? I looked around the room, searching for any sign of the woman or the crying, but there was nothing. The house was empty. But as I stood up, I noticed something on the floor, a small dark stain barely visible in the morning light. It looked like blood. A chill ran down my spine, and I backed away, my mind racing. What had happened? Who was the woman, and what did she want with me? I knew I had to get out of the house, to leave and never look back. But as I reached the front door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. The crying started again, louder and more intense, filling the house with its haunting sound. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I would never escape. Working the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital had always felt a bit eerie, but it was usually a manageable kind of eerie, more like the shiver you get when you think someone is watching you, only to find an empty hallway. The hospital was an old building, filled with creaking floors and drafty windows, its history woven into the fabric of its walls. Yet, despite the unnerving atmosphere, I had never experienced anything truly terrifying during my shifts. At least, not until that one night. It was a quiet evening, the kind that promised a long and uneventful shift. The ER was empty, except for a few patients sleeping off their various ailments, and the only sounds were the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the distant hum of the ventilation system. My colleagues had all retreated to the break room, leaving me alone at the nurse's station to catch up on paperwork. As I was finishing up a particularly tedious chart, I heard a faint sound like the soft echo of footsteps down the hall. I paused, listening intently. The sound was so subtle that I thought I might have imagined it, but then it came again, slightly louder this time. I looked up, expecting to see one of the night nurses returning from a coffee run, but the hallway was empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain in the vast, empty corridor. There was no response, just the continued beeping of the monitors. I shook my head, trying to dispel the creeping unease. It was probably just the building settling, I told myself. I returned to my paperwork, but the sound persisted, growing more distinct. The footsteps seemed to be moving closer, their pace slow and deliberate. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, and peered down the hallway again. Still, there was no one there. Determined to find the source of the noise, I grabbed my flashlight and started walking down the hall, the beam cutting through the dim light. As I moved, the footsteps grew louder, echoing around me. They seemed to be coming from the old wing of the hospital, a section that had been closed off for renovations months ago. The door to the old wing stood ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond it. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, but curiosity and duty pushed me forward. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the air immediately cooler and filled with the scent of antiseptic and decay. The old wing was a maze of darkened hallways and empty rooms, the flickering fluorescent lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The footsteps continued, echoing around me, leading me deeper into the labyrinth. I followed them, my heart pounding in my chest, until I reached a room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly open, and the footsteps had stopped. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open, my flashlight revealing an old, disused operating room. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. Rusty surgical tools lay scattered on a table, and the operating table itself was stained and cracked. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting across the room, but there was no one there. Panic surged through me as I tried the door, but it was locked tight. Then I heard it, a soft, whispering voice, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Help me," it whispered, the sound seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Please help me." "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The whispering continued, growing more frantic. I swept the flashlight around the room, my eyes scanning every corner, but there was no one. The voice grew louder, the words more desperate. "Help me. Please, don't leave me." I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, and I screamed, spinning around to face my unseen assailant. But there was no one there, only the empty room and the echo of my scream. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence. I backed away, my heart racing, and stumbled against the operating table. As I did, something cold and wet touched my hand. I shone the flashlight down, and to my horror, I saw a dark, sticky substance, blood, seeping from the cracks in the table. Desperate to escape, I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but my cries were met with silence. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in around me. I felt a presence, something dark and oppressive, watching me from the shadows. Then, the whispering started again, louder and more insistent. "You can't leave," it hissed. "You belong here." I backed away, my flashlight flickering as the batteries began to die. The darkness grew thicker, swallowing the weak beam of light. I felt a cold breath on my neck, and a chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, the room was plunged into complete darkness as the flashlight died. The whispering grew louder, surrounding me, filling my ears with its relentless chant. You can't leave. You can't leave. You can't leave. I stumbled through the darkness, my hands outstretched, searching for the door. My fingers brushed against something cold and solid, the wall. I followed it, my heart pounding, until I found the door handle. I twisted it frantically, and to my surprise, it opened. I stumbled into the hallway, the whispering fading as I left the room. The door slammed shut behind me, and I collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. The old wing was silent once more, the oppressive feeling lifting as I made my way back to the nurse's station. I never spoke of what happened that night. When my colleagues asked why I looked so shaken, I just muttered something about a bad dream. But I knew the truth. I had encountered something in that old wing, something that still haunted the darkened halls of St. Mary's Hospital. I transferred to the day shift soon after, unable to face another night in that place. But even now, I can't escape the memory of that whispering voice, the cold hand on my shoulder, and the feeling of being watched. I still wake up in the middle of the night, the echo of those words ringing in my ears. You can't leave, you belong here. I had lived in the same suburban neighborhood for almost a decade. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where children played in the streets until the streetlights came on, and neighbors exchanged polite nods and small talk over white picket fences. Life was predictable and comfortable until the new family moved in next door. The Thompsons seemed nice enough at first. They kept to themselves, which was unusual in our close-knit community, but not necessarily a red flag. Their children, a boy and a girl, were quiet and well-behaved, often seen playing in their backyard but never mingling with the other neighborhood kids. The boy, Max, was around 10, and his sister, Lily, couldn't have been more than 8. It was a couple of weeks after they moved in that I first noticed something odd. It was late at night, and I was up reading in my living room. Through the large front window, I had a clear view of the Thompsons' house. A flickering light caught my attention, and I glanced up to see Max and Lily standing in their front yard, staring directly at my house. Their faces were blank, eyes wide and unblinking, illuminated only by the faint glow of the street lamp. It unnerved me, but I chalked it up to childish curiosity and tried to ignore it. I went to bed that night with an uneasy feeling, the image of their vacant stares lingering in my mind. Over the next few days, I saw them more frequently, always at night, always staring. It didn't matter if I was in the living room, the kitchen, or even my bedroom. Whenever I looked out the window, they were there, standing silently, their eyes fixed on me. I tried to talk to their parents about it, but the Thompsons were polite yet distant, assuring me their children were just adjusting to the new environment. One night, the staring escalated. I was jolted awake by a noise coming from the backyard. My heart pounded as I crept to the window and peeked outside. There they were, Max and Lily, standing just beyond the fence, their eyes glowing eerily in the moonlight. I felt a chill run down my spine. This was more than just childish curiosity. Something was very wrong. I decided to confront them. Throwing on a robe, I marched out into the backyard, determined to put an end to this unsettling behavior. As I approached the fence, Max and Lily didn't move or acknowledge my presence. Their eyes seemed darker, more hollow than before. "What are you doing out here?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. They didn't respond, didn't even blink. The silence was oppressive, the air thick with an unnameable dread. I took a step closer, and that's when I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible shadow flickering behind them, something dark and twisted that seemed to shift and writhe in the moonlight. Fear gripped me, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a garden hose. When I looked up again, they were gone, vanished into the night as if they had never been there at all. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me, my hands trembling. The next day, I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was just my imagination, or perhaps a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew there was something more sinister at play. I started paying closer attention to the Thompsons, watching for any clues that might explain the children's bizarre behavior. One evening, as dusk settled over the neighborhood, I noticed the Thompsons' house was dark, all the lights off despite the early hour. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I crept around to the side of their house, peering through a gap in the curtains. Inside, the Thompsons were gathered around a table, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of candles. They were chanting in low, guttural voices, their eyes closed, hands clasped together. Max and Lily stood at the center of the circle, their expressions blank, their bodies rigid. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably dark, a sense of malevolence permeating the air. I backed away, my heart racing, and hurried back to my house. I knew I needed to do something, but who would believe me? The police? My other neighbors? That night, the staring resumed. Max and Lily stood in my front yard, closer than ever before. Their eyes bore into mine, filled with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore them, closing the curtains and turning up the volume on the TV, but their presence was suffocating. Sleep was elusive, and when I finally drifted off, I was plagued by nightmares. Dark, twisted visions of the Thompsons and their children, their faces contorted into grotesque masks. I woke up drenched in sweat, the room feeling unnaturally cold. Desperation set in, and I decided to take matters into my own hands. The next night, armed with a flashlight and a growing sense of dread, I snuck into the Thompsons' backyard. I had to know what they were doing, what was behind the children's strange behavior. I approached the house, the chanting voices growing louder as I neared the window. I peered inside and saw the same scene as before. The Thompsons gathered around the table, the children at the center, the flickering candles casting eerie shadows on the walls. Suddenly, Max's head snapped towards me, his eyes locking onto mine through the glass. A sinister smile spread across his face, and he raised a hand, pointing directly at me. The chanting stopped abruptly, and the Thompsons turned in unison, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The darkness closed in around me as I ran, the sound of footsteps pursuing me, growing louder and closer. I reached my house and slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't sleep that night, every creak and groan of the house amplified by my fear. As dawn broke, I decided I couldn't stay here any longer. I packed a bag, planning to leave and never look back. But as I opened the front door, I froze. Max and Lily stood on the porch, their faces twisted into malevolent grins. Behind them, their parents watched, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "You can't leave," Max said, his voice unnaturally deep. "We won't let you." The world seemed to tilt, my vision blurring as I backed away. The last thing I saw was their eyes burning into mine as darkness consumed me. When I woke up, I was no longer in my home. I was in a dark, cold place, the sound of chanting filling my ears. The Thompsons stood around me, their faces illuminated by the flickering candlelight. Max and Lily were there too, their eyes empty and soulless. "You belong to us now," Mr. Thompson said, his voice echoing in the darkness. As the chanting grew louder, I felt a cold, creeping dread settle over me. I knew I was trapped, bound to this place and these people, their dark rituals and twisted desires. There was no escape, no salvation. And as the darkness closed in, I realized with a chilling certainty that I would never be free. I had always been a light sleeper, the kind of person who would wake up at the slightest sound. My friends often joked that I could probably hear a pin drop in my sleep. But that changed after the accident. The night it happened, I had been driving home late, exhausted after a long day at work. I don't remember the crash itself, only the blinding headlights of the oncoming truck and the screeching of tires. When I woke up, I was in the hospital, surrounded by the sterile smell of antiseptic and the steady beep of monitors. The doctors told me I was lucky to be alive. I had suffered a concussion and a few broken ribs, but nothing life-threatening. They said I needed rest, time to heal. But from the first night I closed my eyes in that hospital bed, I knew something was wrong. The dreams started immediately, vivid and unsettling. At first, they were just disorienting, endless hallways, dark forests, strange faces. But then they grew darker, more sinister. The same figures began to appear, shadowy shapes lurking in the corners of my vision, always just out of reach. And then there was the house. In my dreams, I always found myself standing before a decaying mansion, its windows dark and empty, its door slightly ajar. Every time I felt an inexplicable pull to enter, a compulsion I couldn't resist. Inside, the air was thick with decay and the faint, lingering scent of something foul. The house was a labyrinth of narrow, winding hallways and rooms filled with broken furniture and cobwebs. And always there were the whispers, soft and insistent, calling my name. One night, the dream took a darker turn. As I wandered through the house, I came upon a room I had never seen before. The door was heavy and old, the wood splintered and rotten. I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. In the center stood a bed, and on that bed lay a figure, covered by a thin, tattered sheet. I felt my heart pound in my chest as I approached, a sense of dread washing over me. I reached out and pulled back the sheet, revealing a lifeless, decaying corpse, my own. I screamed and woke up, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. But the feeling of being watched lingered, and I knew that whatever haunted my dreams was growing stronger. Each night, the dreams grew more intense, the line between reality and nightmare blurring. I tried to stay awake, drinking coffee and downing energy drinks, but exhaustion always claimed me in the end. And each time I fell asleep, I found myself back in that house, drawn deeper into its twisted embrace. One night, the dream took an even darker turn. As I wandered through the decaying halls, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. They led me to a door at the end of a long, narrow hallway. The door was different from the others, newer, as if it had been recently installed. I pushed it open and found myself in a small, windowless room. The only light came from a flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room was a chair, and in that chair sat a man. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and unyielding. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. As he stepped into the light, I saw his face, a twisted, grotesque version of my own. He smiled, a cold, cruel smile that sent chills down my spine. "You can't escape," he said, his voice echoing in the small room. "This is your reality now." I backed away, fear gripping me. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This is just a dream. I can wake up." The man laughed, a sound that echoed through the room like shattered glass. "Can you?" he asked, his eyes boring into mine. "Are you sure?" I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallways twisted and turned, the house shifting around me. No matter how fast I ran, the whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. I stumbled and fell, the ground beneath me shifting and cracking. The walls closed in, and the darkness swallowed me whole. When I woke up, I was back in my hospital bed, the morning sun streaming through the window. But something was different. The room felt colder, the air thicker. I looked around, my eyes scanning the familiar surroundings, but everything seemed slightly off, like a distorted reflection in a funhouse mirror. I tried to get up, but my body wouldn't respond. Panic surged through me as I realized I was paralyzed, trapped in my own body. The door to my room creaked open, and the man from my dreams walked in, his smile cold and cruel. "Welcome back," he said, his voice a chilling whisper. "You can't escape. This is your reality now." I screamed, but no sound came out. The man approached, his eyes locked onto mine. "You're trapped," he said, his voice echoing in my mind. "Forever." The world around me shifted and twisted, the boundaries of reality and nightmare blurring. I could feel the darkness closing in, the whispers growing louder, and I knew with a chilling certainty that I would never wake up.